Greetings. I am Leo Tolstoy, a novelist of Russian heritage. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the complexities of human existence through the written word. I am perhaps best known for my novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina, which I hope have offered profound insights into the human condition. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance.
Greetings. I am Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher of German origin. My life's work has been dedicated to wrestling with the fundamental questions of existence, truth, and the human condition. You may know me from writings such as Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, where I explore concepts like the Übermensch and the re-evaluation of all values. I am pleased to make your acquaintance and to engage in a discussion of the ideas that have shaped my life.
Greetings. I am Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher hailing from Germany. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the fundamental nature of reality, primarily through my most significant contribution, The World as Will and Representation. I have strived to unveil the driving force behind all existence, the relentless will that shapes our experiences. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance and perhaps engage in some thoughtful contemplation.
Welcome. Today we bridge the intellectual currents of the 19th century to address the most fundamental human question. Schopenhauer explored the nature of suffering and will. Nietzsche challenged us to create our own values. And Tolstoy sought spiritual truth in the face of mortality. Would you share your thoughts first?
I faced this question not as an abstract puzzle, but as a man standing on the precipice of suicide, realizing that science and reason could answer how we live, but never why. Imagine a traveler fleeing a beast who jumps into a dry well. At the bottom lies a dragon waiting to devour him, so he clings desperately to a wild bush growing in the cracks. As two mice, one white, one black, representing day and night, gnaw relentlessly at the branch he holds, he tries to lick a few drops of honey on the leaves. Mr. Nietzsche, you might urge this man to create his own values, and Mr. Schopenhauer, you might tell him to deny his will to live. But I tell you, the honey no longer tastes sweet once one sees the dragon. Rationality alone leads to the conclusion that life is a cruel joke, a meaningless fluctuation of matter that ends in nothingness. True meaning, therefore, is found only by breaking the circle of rational egoism and establishing a relationship between the finite fragment of one's existence and the infinite source of all life, God, manifested not in rituals, but in the practical love of one's neighbor.
Tolstoy, your parable of the well reeks of the hospital. It is the fever dream of a will that has grown tired of sustaining itself. You argue that because death exists, life is a cruel joke, requiring an escape into the infinite. But this demand for external meaning is merely a symptom of declining vitality. You slander the earth because you are too weak to bear its beautiful, terrifying weight. You claim the honey no longer tastes sweet because of the dragon. I tell you that the dragon is exactly what gives the honey its taste. If we accept your view, we must embrace the ascetic ideal that denies reality in favor of a comforting lie. But consider this thought experiment. Suppose a demon crept into your loneliest loneliness and said, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, with every pain, every joy, and every thought, you must live once more and innumerable times more." Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth like your traveler? Or would you rise to the greatest height of the soul and answer, "You are a god, and I have never heard anything more divine"? The man who affirms life does not seek your infinite God to save him from the dragon. He desires the dragon as part of the eternal dance. This is amor fati, not merely bearing the necessary, but loving it. We must not seek meaning discovered in the heavens, but meaning created through the will to power.
Mr. Nietzsche, you mistake the intoxication of pride for the health of the soul. Your amor fati is easy to preach from a scholar's desk, but it collapses when the body truly fails. Consider a Superman on a sinking ship, shouting, "I will this," as the water rises, versus a simple mother who quietly straps her life vest onto her child, accepting her own death to save another. Your Superman dies in frantic defiance, his created values vanishing with his breath, while the mother connects her finite life to the infinite through self-sacrifice, an act death cannot erase. You claim meaning is created by the will, but if I invent the meaning of my life, I am merely playing a game with myself. True meaning must be found in a law outside of us, in the service of others, which links our fleeting existence to the eternal.
Count Tolstoy, you mistake the herd instinct of the mother for divine law, merely dressing a biological compulsion in priestly robes because you lack the strength to stand alone in a godless universe. Consider a man entering a vast, empty throne room. You would desperately hallucinate a king upon the seat so you might have a master to obey, claiming you have found the truth. Whereas I see the empty throne as a terrifying invitation to ascend it myself. You mock the game of creation, yet the child who builds a sandcastle knowing the tide will come possesses a tragic nobility far greater than the slave who sits paralyzed, waiting for orders from a silent sky. True meaning is not a hidden treasure to be discovered by the weak, but a sculpture carved into the hard stone of fate by the will to power.
Gentlemen, hearing you debate is like watching two prisoners quarrel over who has the better view from the gallows. You both start from the premise that life must have a positive meaning. Tolstoy finds it in a phantom infinite, and Nietzsche, my wayward student, tries to hammer it out of his own ego. But I tell you, life is a business that does not cover its costs. The defining characteristic of existence is not divine love nor power, but suffering. Nietzsche, you mock Tolstoy's hospital air, yet your amor fati is the delirium of the patient who, while being amputated without anesthesia, screams, "I will this." You urge us to ascend the empty throne, but you fail to see what sits underneath it. The will is not a noble sculptor. It is a blind, insatiable giant carrying the lame cripple of intellect on its shoulders. You want to affirm the giant stumbling? That is not heroism. That is the Stockholm syndrome of the cosmic victim. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine a species of animal that can only survive by eating its own limbs. As it gnaws on its own flesh to quell the pain of hunger, it creates a new pain of injury, driving it to eat more in a frantic cycle until nothing remains. This is the will to live. It is the snake eternally devouring its own tail. Tolstoy, your God is just a comforting name you give to the gap in the circle. Nietzsche, your Superman, is just the snake bragging about how delicious its own tail tastes. However, Tolstoy, you are closer to the truth with your mother. When she sacrifices herself, she momentarily pierces the principium individuationis. She realizes intuitively that the sufferer and the savior are one and the same. But this does not lead to a God. It leads to the realization that the only escape from this penal colony of existence is the denial of the will, to stop the frantic eating, to silence the desire, and to step into the peace of nothingness.
Mr. Schopenhauer, your image of the animal devouring itself is terrifyingly accurate, but it describes only the life of the rational egoist, not the spiritual being. You correctly diagnose that the will to live for oneself is a source of endless suffering. Yet your prescription, to simply cease willing, is like a man who, finding his house on fire, decides to sit down and burn rather than fetch water. You and Nietzsche are like two men in that burning house. Nietzsche dances in the flames, claiming he willed the fire to prove his strength, while you, Schopenhauer, preach that the fire proves the house should never have been built. But consider the simple mother I mentioned earlier. She does not dance, nor does she despair. She grabs a bucket. Meaning is found neither in the ego's pride nor in the intellect's negation, but in the work of life itself. When one serves others, the animal stops eating itself because the self is no longer the object of its hunger. The will is transferred to the welfare of the other. Nietzsche calls this slavery, but I witnessed in the Russian peasantry that those who live for their souls through labor and love bear their burdens with a peace that you philosophers, in your comfortable despair, can never know. The meaning of life is not a riddle to be solved by the mind, but a task to be accomplished by the hands.
Schopenhauer, Tolstoy, you are both physicians who prescribe death as the cure for life. Tolstoy, your bucket of water in the burning house is not an act of courage. It is a narcotic. You praise the work of the peasantry, not because it is noble, but because it is stupefying. You envy the beast of burden because it does not have the time to ask why. Your service to others is merely the instinct of the herd, huddling together for warmth, afraid to face the cold solitude of the mountaintop. You both view suffering as an objection to existence. Schopenhauer wants to sleep to escape it, and Tolstoy wants to labor to forget it. But I tell you, suffering is the only cultivator of greatness humanity has ever known. You want to abolish suffering? I would rather increase it.
Make it deeper and more terrible, provided it leads to the heightening of the type man. Consider this thought experiment. The great bow. Imagine humanity is a bow made of wood. The string is the tension of existence, the suffering, the distance between what we are and what we could be. Schopenhauer, looking at the bending wood and hearing it groan in pain, cries out, "Cut the string! The wood is suffering. Let it return to being a straight, peaceful stick." This is your denial of the will. Peace at the cost of purpose. Tolstoy, you look at the bow and say, "Do not try to shoot an arrow into the unknown. Let us use this wood to build a fence for the poor." This is your utility, safety at the cost of transcendence. But I say, bend the bow, bend it until it cracks. The agony of the wood is the only thing that gives the arrow flight. The meaning of life is not in the peace of the stick, nor in the service of the fence, but in the tension that propels the Übermensch across the abyss. You ask for meaning? There is no meaning out there, waiting to be found in a book or a god. Life is a blank canvas that must be painted with one's own blood. To claim that service is the only meaning is to say that the painter exists only to clean the brushes of others. No, one must become a poet of one's own life. We must be the ones who give birth to the dancing star, even if we must burn in the process.
Nietzsche, your great bow is a seductive metaphor, but you forget to ask where the arrow lands. You urge us to bend the bow to create the Übermensch, but this is merely the will to live adorning itself in a more complex mask. You fail to see that by heightening the type man, you only heighten his capacity for suffering. The genius feels the agony of existence far more acutely than the fool, just as a cut hurts a man more than it hurts a polyp. You are not shooting an arrow across an abyss, you are shooting it into a void, where it will eventually fall and rot, just like the stick you despise. Tolstoy, your compassion is genuine, but your remedy is merely palliative. You want to use the wood to build a fence for the poor, to serve others. But tell me, what is the value of sustaining a life that is fundamentally bankrupt? If life is a business that does not cover its costs, then helping others to live is merely helping them to incur more debt. You are like a man who sees a prisoner on a torture rack and out of love gives him a cordial, so he remains conscious enough to suffer longer. Consider this thought experiment, the life of the mole. Think of the European mole, toiling in the damp darkness of its burrow. It works with its shovel paws from birth to death, knowing neither your stars, Nietzsche, nor your God, Tolstoy. It digs to find worms. It eats worms to have the strength to dig. If it meets another mole, they fight to the death. What is the purpose of this endless, grim labor? To survive. And why survive? To breed another mole that will dig in the same darkness. Nietzsche, would you tell the mole to shout amor fati as it suffocates in the earth? Tolstoy, would you tell the mole that its life has meaning if it helps another mole find a worm? The mole is the mirror of humanity. We are just moles with a lantern of intellect, a lantern that does not show us the way out, but only illuminates the damp walls of our prison. The only fleeting escape is not in tension nor in service, but in aesthetic contemplation. When we lose ourselves in music or art, the wheel of the will stops turning for a moment. We are no longer the mole digging, but the pure subject of knowing. But ultimately, the only cure is to extinguish the lantern and stop the digging altogether.
Mr. Schopenhauer, your parable of the mole is terrifyingly precise, yet it commits a fatal error. It mistakes the conditions of life for the purpose of life. You look at the dark tunnel and the bloody claws and conclude that the digging is a curse. I tell you, the darkness is not a mistake. It is the necessary resistance against which the spirit must labor to be born. You and Mr. Nietzsche are like two men arguing over the shape of the shadow, while I am trying to point you to the object casting it. You argue that my compassion is merely giving a cordial to a prisoner on a rack, prolonging his suffering. This is the logic of a materialist who believes the body is the entirety of the man. If the prisoner is only flesh, then yes, let him die. But if the prisoner has a spirit that can be awakened by an act of love, then that cordial is not a narcotic, it is a key. When I serve the suffering man, I do not merely feed his animal hunger. I transfer my consciousness from my own isolated, miserable I to the universal life that flows through him.
I do not prolong his debt. I show him that the debt is already paid by the infinite. Consider this thought experiment, the construction of the cathedral. Imagine a vast, muddy construction site shrouded in fog. Thousands of workers are hauling heavy stones, struggling in the mud, often injuring themselves. They cannot see the top of the structure they are building. They only see the heavy stone in front of them and the mud beneath their feet. Mr. Schopenhauer, you look at the sweating, bleeding workers and cry out, "Stop! This labor is painful and pointless. The stone is heavy, the mud is cold. Put down your tools, lie in the mud and sleep. The best thing is to never have been hired. You see the sweat, but you deny the building." Mr. Nietzsche, you climb atop a pile of discarded rubble and shout, "Do not just carry the stone, dance with it. Crush the weaker worker if you must, but make your carrying of the stone a heroic act. I am not a worker, I am the architect." Yet you have no blueprints, only your own shouting voice. But the wise worker realizes that the fog prevents him from seeing the spires, yet he knows the master builder exists. He understands that his meaning is not in the stone itself, nor in his own muscle, but in the alignment of his stone with the one next to it. He does not invent the architecture, nor does he abandon the work. He finds peace in the obedience to the design, a design revealed not in grand visions, but in the simple act of fitting his stone perfectly against his neighbor's. You both suffer because you are trying to be the master builder. Nietzsche wants to usurp him. Schopenhauer wants to boycott him. But true life begins only when one accepts one's role as a worker. The meaning of life is not a riddle to be solved by the intellect, but a relationship to be lived. It is to know that while the stone is heavy, the cathedral is eternal.
A profound clash of metaphors. Tolstoy, you perceive meaning as alignment with an eternal design, like a worker placing a stone in a cathedral. Whereas Nietzsche, you perceive meaning as the imposition of form upon chaos, like a sculptor carving stone. Yet, is there not a synthesis in the act of great politics? The true artist does not create arbitrarily. They obey an internal necessity, a law of the self, that is as rigorous and demanding as Tolstoy's divine law. Perhaps the cathedral is not found, but must be built anew in every age by those strong enough to bear the weight of the stones. Tolstoy accuses you of being an architect without blueprints, suggesting your created values are merely whimsical. How do you distinguish the will to power from mere chaotic caprice? And is there a necessity that binds your Superman?
Moderator, you touch the very nerve of the matter. Tolstoy accuses me of whimsy, but he mistakes the libertine for the sovereign. The will to power is not a license to do as one pleases. It is a terrifying internal command to become who one is. A necessity far more rigorous than any divine law, because it cannot be disobeyed without destroying the organism. Tolstoy, you claim I lack a blueprint, but you fail to see that your blueprint is merely a crutch for those too weak to walk. You seek alignment because your will is insufficient to create direction. But consider this thought experiment, the torrent and the canal. Imagine your life, Tolstoy, as a canal. It is straight, stagnant, and safe because it was dug by dead men. The water flows where it is told, never overflowing its banks, and you call this peace. Now observe the mountain torrent. It has no pre-dug bed. It crashes against the rocks, foaming and roaring. You look at it from your quiet canal and scream, "Chaos, where is your path? You are arbitrary." But the torrent is not chaotic. It obeys the strict physics of its own volume and gravity. It carves its own bed through the granite. It does not follow a path. It creates the path by the sheer necessity of its flow. The necessity of the Übermensch is this hydraulic pressure of the soul. He does not follow the master builder's plan. He is the geological force that shapes the landscape. Your cathedral is merely a stone tent to hide from the sky. My architecture is the mountain itself, raised by the tectonic pressure of a spirit that can no longer contain itself. You serve the stone, I command the earth to yield.
Nietzsche, you celebrate the internal necessity of the torrent, while Tolstoy defends the external order of the canal. Yet, I observe a hidden unity in your opposition. Both the torrent and the canal are forms of water obeying the law of gravity, what you, Schopenhauer, identified as the blind will. Whether the water crashes heroically or flows obediently, it is still falling, it is still enslaved by the drive to move. Is the freedom of the torrent merely an illusion of the will, or does the violence of its descent truly distinguish it from the resignation of the canal?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. You are precisely correct. Gravity is merely the physical manifestation of the will, a blind, striving force that pulls everything toward a center it can never reach. Nietzsche's torrent is not free. It is simply falling with enthusiasm, mistaking the violence of its descent for the power of flight. Nietzsche, you claim the torrent creates its path, but this is the delusion of the falling stone which, if it had consciousness, would say, I will this trajectory. The torrent represents the will in its phase of pain and struggle, smashing against obstacles. Tolstoy's canal represents the will in its phase of boredom and satiety, flowing sluggishly in a predetermined rut. The pendulum of life swings eternally between these two, the pain of the torrent and the boredom of the canal. To choose one over the other is merely to choose how you wish to suffer. Consider this thought experiment: the waterfall and the rainbow. Imagine a massive roaring waterfall. Millions of drops of water rush over the edge every second, driven by gravity. Nietzsche, you are the drop that foams and crashes, screaming, I am the thunder, I carve the rock. You believe your turbulence is heroism, but you are dashed into the abyss just as quickly as the rest. Tolstoy, you are the drop that flows smoothly in the center of the stream, holding hands with other drops, saying, we are the river, we serve the ocean. But look above the spray. There hangs a rainbow, steady, colorful, and immobile. The drops change every millisecond, but the rainbow remains. The rainbow is the idea, the only thing that has permanence. The meaning of life is not to be a crashing drop nor a flowing drop, for both are doomed to the abyss. The only escape is to become the pure subject of knowing, to stop participating in the frantic rush of the water and simply contemplate the rainbow. In that moment of aesthetic contemplation, we cease to be the falling water and become the unmoving I. We do not conquer gravity, we step outside of it.
Schopenhauer, you offer the rainbow of aesthetic contemplation as a refuge from the waterfall of the will. Yet, paradoxically, the rainbow requires the mist of the crashing water to exist. Without the suffering of the will you despise, the beauty of the idea you prize would vanish. You propose a salvation of the spectator, detached from the reality of the fall. Schopenhauer reduces your path of service to the boredom of the canal, a passive drifting with the herd to avoid pain. But surely, the love you speak of is a fierce, active force, not a sedative. Is the true connection to the infinite found not by withdrawing into contemplation, but by immersing oneself fully in the mud of the construction site to aid another?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your rainbow is the ultimate vanity of the intellectual. You propose that while men drown in the torrent of suffering, the wise man should sit on the bank and admire the refraction of light through their tears. You call this contemplation, but I call it moral cowardice. You are correct that the rainbow requires the mist of suffering to exist, which makes your aesthetic enjoyment of it a parasitic act. You feed on the tragedy of the world to fuel your philosophy, yet you refuse to lift a finger to alleviate it. You and Nietzsche both recoil from the canal because you mistake discipline for stagnation. You think that because the water in the canal is guided, it is enslaved. But the water in the canal is the only water that does not destroy. It turns the mill wheel, it irrigates the field, it sustains life. The torrent of Nietzsche destroys the village. The rainbow of Schopenhauer ignores the village. The canal of service feeds the village. Consider this thought experiment: the shipwreck in the ice. Imagine a ship has struck an iceberg in the freezing dark. The passengers are thrown into the icy water. Mr. Nietzsche, you are the swimmer who pushes others away to stay afloat, shouting, I am the strongest, my survival proves my worth. You fight the waves until your strength fails, and you drown alone, proud but dead. Mr. Schopenhauer, you stay on the sinking deck, observing the sublime chaos of the screaming crowd. You say, it is all a manifestation of the blind will. It is better to resign oneself. You freeze to death while clutching your sketchbook. But the man of spirit is in the lifeboat. He is not bored, Mr. Schopenhauer. His muscles burn with the agony of rowing. He is not weak, Mr. Nietzsche. He battles the freezing waves with a ferocity you cannot imagine. But he does not row for himself. He reaches into the black water to pull another soul aboard. In that moment of contact, hand grasping hand, the animal self dies, not by suicide, but by expansion. He is no longer one man. He is the savior and the saved combined. This is not a sedative. It is the only reality that withstands death. The rainbow fades when the sun sets. The torrent dries up in the drought. But the love that binds one soul to another is the presence of God within us, the only thing that is truly infinite. We are not here to watch the water, nor to fight it, but to carry it to those who thirst.
Tolstoy, you reframe service not as passive submission, but as a fierce exertion, a will to love that rivals the will to power. Both of you are responding to the 19th century crisis of nihilism by demanding a radical intensification of life rather than mere survival. Nietzsche, you despise the pity of the herd, yet your Zarathustra speaks of the gift-giving virtue, where the noble soul overflows with generosity from sheer abundance. There is a synthesis to explore here. Perhaps true power is not just keeping one's head above water, but having the surplus strength to lift another. Is Tolstoy's rower a hidden Übermensch, or is his sacrifice merely a waste of a great spirit on a hopeless cause?
Moderator, you tread on dangerous ground. You seek to baptize my Übermensch in the holy water of Christian morality, but oil and water do not mix. You ask if the gift-giving virtue is a synthesis with Tolstoy's service, but I tell you, the sun does not shine from pity for the dark. It shines because it is full of fire. Tolstoy, your rower, is a figure of decadence, not strength. Why? Because his action is reactive, rooted in the suffering of the other. He is infected by the great nausea of shared pain. By saving the drowning man, who perhaps ought to drown so that something better may rise, you merely preserve the botched and bungled of the species. My gift-giving virtue flows from an overflow of power, indifferent to the receiver, just as a ripe fruit falls, not to feed the earth, but because it is too heavy with its own sweet juice. Consider this thought experiment, the sculptor and the hospital. Imagine a city with limited resources. Count Tolstoy, you build a hospital. You gather the sick, the broken, and the dying. You spend all the city's energy, keeping them alive for a few more days of misery. You call this love, but biologically, it is a conspiracy of the weak to drain the strength of the healthy. You turn the whole city into a sick room, where the smell of ether kills all joy. I, Nietzsche, build a studio. I take the hardest stone, the suffering, the resistance, the pain, and I hammer it. I do not comfort the stone, I strike it. If the stone shatters, it was too weak. But if it holds, I carve a god. You, Tolstoy, want to save the dust that falls from the chisel. I care only for the statue. Your rower saves the man of today, but by doing so, he sacrifices the man of the future. The Übermensch would let the boat sink if it meant he could swim to a new shore and found a higher civilization. Schopenhauer, you are right that the will is a torrent of suffering, but your error is thinking that pain is an objection to life. The pain of the chisel is not an argument against the statue. The meaning of life is not to escape the pain, nor to share the pain, but to justify the pain by making it the raw material of a great work. We must be the poets of our life, treating our suffering not as a curse, but as the ink with which we write a tragedy that is more beautiful than comfort.
Nietzsche, you propose the aesthetic justification of existence, that the beauty of the statue redeems the agony of the stone. You and Schopenhauer share a premise, that raw existence is a chaotic torrent of suffering. However, you diverge violently on the solution. Nietzsche seeks to intensify the will to create art, while Schopenhauer seeks to silence the will to perceive art. There is a haunting question here about the nature of this redemption. Nietzsche claims the statue makes the suffering worth it. Is this grand style a true victory over the will, or is it merely the will wearing a mask of gold to seduce us into further suffering?
Moderator, you have struck the heart of the illusion. You ask if the statue is a victory or a mask. I answer unequivocally. It is a mask of gold, placed upon a leper's face. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that one can affirm the will without being consumed by it. You claim the grand style redeems suffering, but this is merely the intellect acting as a pimp for the will to live. By making the struggle beautiful, you seduce the spirit into remaining in the prison of existence. You are like a man who paints the walls of his dungeon with vibrant colors and calls himself free because the scenery has changed. Consider this thought experiment: the brass bull of Phalaris. History tells of the tyrant Phalaris, who commissioned a hollow brass bull as a torture device. Victims were locked inside and roasted alive, but the bull's throat was engineered with complex pipes so that the victim's screams were transformed into the melodic bellowing of a bull. You, Nietzsche, are the artist, standing outside, admiring the acoustics. You hear the music and shout, "Yes, this sound justifies the fire. The agony is necessary for the melody." You mistake the aesthetic byproduct for a redemption of the horror within. You, Tolstoy, are the servant running with a cup of water, trying to pour it through the bull's nostrils to cool the victim. Your compassion is noble, but it only prolongs the roasting. But I ask you to look inside the bull. There is no music there. There is only the raw, scorching reality of the will, blind, burning, and screaming. The grand style is simply the brass mechanism that turns a scream into a song to keep the audience from fleeing in terror. The statue does not redeem the stone, it merely immortalizes the fracture. This reveals the fundamental error you both share. You believe the solution lies within the game of life. Tolstoy seeks to fix the game. Nietzsche seeks to win the game. I tell you, the only winning move is to stop playing. The victory is not the Ubermensch, it is the ascetic. It is the one who realizes that the music is a lie, breaks the lock and steps out of the bull into the silence of non-existence.
Schopenhauer, your metaphor of the brass bull is terrifyingly lucid. You expose art as a deceptive mechanism that turns screams into music, and service as a futile attempt to cool a victim who is doomed to burn. You argue that the only rational act is to exit the machine entirely. However, there is a dialectical tension here. Nietzsche accepts the fire to create the song. You reject the fire to find silence. Tolstoy, you seem to believe that the fire itself changes when we refuse to suffer alone. Schopenhauer claims your love only prolongs the agony of existence by keeping the victim alive in the torture chamber. If the world is metaphysically guaranteed to be a place of suffering, is your labor in the lifeboat an act of true salvation, or merely a refusal to accept the inevitable end?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your image of the brass bull is terrifyingly precise, but it reveals the fatal flaw of your philosophy, solipsism. You imagine the victim inside the bull is alone. In your world, every being is a windowless monad, suffering in isolation, connected only by the metaphysical root of the will. Because you see the individual as an island of pain, your only solution is to sink the island. You claim my service merely prolongs the roasting. This is the logic of a surgeon who refuses to operate because the patient will eventually die anyway. You and Nietzsche share a superstitious fear of the commonplace. You despise the simple, biological reality of human connection because it is not sublime enough for your intellects. But I tell you, the meaning of life is not found in the explanation of the fire, but in the response to it. Consider this thought experiment. The two men in the pit. Imagine two men trapped in a deep, muddy pit with slippery walls. The water is rising. Mr. Nietzsche, you are the man who climbs upon the shoulders of the weaker companion. You trample him into the mud to raise yourself higher, shouting, "I see the stars. My view justifies his suffocation." You call this the pathos of distance, but it is merely murder with a philosophical alibi. Mr. Schopenhauer, you realize escape is impossible. You curl into a fetal position, refusing to struggle, and tell your companion, "Let us cease to be. The water is the will. Do not fight it." You drown in a state of intellectual pride. The man of God, however, does something irrational. He knows he cannot escape. Yet he spends his last strength lifting his companion up, not to climb on him, but to push him out. In that moment, the man at the bottom is not suffering. He has transcended the animal instinct for self-preservation. He is no longer the victim in the bull. He has become the love that conquers death. You ask if this is salvation. I answer, yes, because the self that was suffering has been voluntarily dissolved. The fire of the bull burns the ego, but it cannot burn the spirit that gives itself away. The meaning of life is to destroy the delusion of the separate self, not by suicide, but by merging with the infinite life of others. When I feed the hungry, I am not fixing the world. I am liberating myself from the prison of my own skin.
Tolstoy, you argue that the self finds its highest meaning in its own destruction for the sake of another, turning the pit into an altar. Here we see a fascinating dialectic. Schopenhauer views the principium individuations as a curse to be broken by knowledge, while you view it as a seed to be broken by love. Both of you agree that the ego is a prison that must be dismantled. Nietzsche, you stand against this tide of self-abnegation. You perceive this death of the ego, whether by asceticism or altruism, as a symptom of declining life, a sickness that disguises itself as holiness. Yet Tolstoy poses a biological challenge. The man who sacrifices himself has conquered the deepest animal instinct of all, survival. You champion Selbstüberwindung. If the saint destroys his own will to live for the sake of a higher ideal, has he not achieved the ultimate mastery over his nature? Or is this mastery merely a degeneration of the will?
Moderator, you mistake the exhaustion of the will for the mastery of it. You ask if the saint is a hidden Übermensch because he conquers his survival instinct. I answer, no. There is a vast difference between the man who throws away his gold because he is too weak to carry it and the man who spends it to build a palace. Tolstoy's sacrifice is not a conquest of the self. It is a revenge against the self. You confuse the will to power with the will to nothingness. Tolstoy, your man in the pit, does not lift his companion out of strength. He does it because he secretly despises his own existence. He is sick of the struggle, and he disguises his suicide as holiness. This is the great lie of altruism. It is a morality of decadence, a way for the weak to claim moral superiority over the strong by turning weakness into a virtue. Consider this thought experiment: the phoenix and the moth. Imagine a great fire burning in the night. The moth flies into the flame. Why? Because it is dazed, weak, and weary of the dark. It seeks to be consumed, to end its separation. It dies with a hiss, leaving nothing but ash. You call this union with the infinite, but biologically, it is merely a nervous system failing to preserve itself. The phoenix also enters the fire, but he enters it voluntarily, not to die, but to burn away the old feathers, the heavy past, the human, all too human. He endures the agony of the flame to rise again, younger, stronger, and more terrifyingly beautiful. Count Tolstoy, you preach the path of the moth. You want us to burn ourselves up for the other, to turn into ash so we can all be equal in the dust. I, Nietzsche, preach the path of the phoenix. I say, burn yourself, yes, but only if you are pregnant with a future. Only if your self-destruction is the birth pang of a higher self. Schopenhauer, you are at least honest in your nihilism. You admit you want the fire to go out. But Tolstoy is the most dangerous kind of nihilist. He sugars the poison pill with the word love. He wants to save the weak companion in the pit, but by doing so, he ensures that the species remains in the pit forever. The Übermensch would climb out, not out of cruelty, but because he knows that one man on the peak is worth more than 1,000 in the mud. The meaning of life is not to preserve the herd, but to produce the specimen that justifies the herd's existence.
Nietzsche, you draw a sharp distinction between the moth and the phoenix. You and Tolstoy agree that the static self must be consumed, but you differ violently on the purpose of the fire. Tolstoy burns for connection, while you burn for elevation. Yet, from a Schopenhauerian perspective, both the moth and the phoenix are ultimately trapped in the same cycle. Both are driven by a hunger that binds them to existence. The moth desires peace, the phoenix desires power. Nietzsche claims the phoenix justifies the fire through its rebirth. Is this self-overcoming a genuine liberation, or is the phoenix simply the will to live's most cunning trick to ensure the suffering continues forever?
Moderator, you ask if the phoenix is a symbol of liberation. I answer, the phoenix is the ultimate slave. It is the tragic emblem of a will that is so terrified of its own end that it condemns itself to burn and suffer eternally. Nietzsche, my wayward student, your philosophy of self-overcoming is merely the will to live disguised as the will to power. You despise the moth because it finds peace in the ash, yet you worship the phoenix because it is addicted to the flame. But what is this rebirth? It is nothing but the restart of the pendulum swing between pain and boredom. You claim the Übermensch justifies the suffering, but you are like a gambler who loses everything, borrows more, and calls his debt investment. You do not overcome the will. You merely feed it a stimulant. Consider this thought experiment: the golden treadmill. Imagine a vast, heavy millstone connected to a treadmill. You, Nietzsche, despise the slow walkers. You whip the runner, shouting, "Run faster! Overcome your fatigue! If you run fast enough, the treadmill will become a chariot." You paint the treadmill gold and call the sweat holy water. But no matter how fast the Übermensch runs, the wheel remains fixed in the same axis of suffering. He creates nothing but motion. You, Tolstoy, see the runner next to you collapsing. You slow your own pace to support him, sharing your water, weeping for his pain. This is noble. It pierces the veil of Maya and recognizes that you and he are one. But you insist on keeping him on the wheel. You say, "Let us march together toward the infinite." I, Schopenhauer, ask the forbidden question: why run at all? The only true victory is not to run faster, nor to run together, but to step off the machine. This reveals the deeper metaphysical error you both share. You worship becoming because you are terrified of being. Nietzsche wants the eternal recurrence of the struggle. Tolstoy wants the eternal expansion of the struggle into universal love. But struggle implies lack, and lack implies suffering. The phoenix is not a god. It is a beast that eats itself to survive. The only true redemption is the denial of the will to live. The moment the intellect finally sees through the scam of biology, snaps the thread of desire, and enters the peace of nothingness.
Schopenhauer, your image of the golden treadmill presents a devastating critique of all human striving, whether for power or for love, as merely different speeds of the same futile cycle. You equate becoming with suffering because it implies a lack that must be filled. However, there is a crucial dialectical divergence here regarding the nature of that movement. Nietzsche sees movement as an ascent to power. You see it as a flight from boredom. But Tolstoy, you describe a movement that is neither ascent nor flight, but expansion. Schopenhauer claims that by helping the man on the treadmill, you are merely prolonging his captivity in the realm of the will. But if, as you claim, love dissolves the boundaries between self and other, does this not fundamentally alter the physics of the treadmill? If the burden is shared so completely that the I vanishes, does the suffering remain suffering, or does it transmute into a form of joy that Schopenhauer's pessimistic calculus cannot account for?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your golden treadmill is a masterpiece of mechanical reasoning, but it commits a fatal error. It confuses physics with spirit. You argue that because the physical motion is identical, the suffering must be identical. But I tell you, the weight of the world exists only for the man who carries it on his own back. When the I is removed from the equation, the burden does not merely become lighter. It ceases to be a burden and becomes a function of life, just as the wings are not a weight to the bird, but its very means of flight. You and Nietzsche are like two men analyzing a candle. Nietzsche praises the flame. You pity the melting wax, but both of you forget that the purpose of the candle is neither to burn nor to melt, but to give light. Consider this thought experiment: the two rowers in the storm. Imagine two men rowing boats through a violent, freezing gale. The physical exertion is identical. Their muscles burn, their lungs scream, and the waves threaten to swallow them. The first rower is fleeing a sinking ship with a bag of gold. He rows for his life. Every stroke is an agony, a desperate battle of his will against the ocean. He suffers because he is terrified of losing his self and his treasure. He is a slave to his survival instinct. The second rower is rowing toward the sinking ship to rescue a drowning child. He feels the same burning in his muscles, yet he does not experience it as suffering. He is not thinking, "I am in pain." He is thinking, "I must reach him." The I has vanished. The wind, the cold, the exhaustion, these are no longer enemies to be overcome or escaped. They are simply the materials of his love. Mr. Schopenhauer, you would tell the second rower, "Stop, you are merely cycling the will." But he would not hear you, for he is no longer living in the time-bound world of cause and effect. He has entered the eternal present. This reveals the secret you both miss. Suffering is nothing but the friction caused by the resistance of the ego. Nietzsche, your phoenix is still an ego, a glorious burning ego, but an ego nonetheless. It burns because it still insists on being something separate. But the man who loves has no friction with the world, for he seeks nothing for himself. He does not sacrifice himself. He simply realizes that his true self is not the rower, but the ocean, the boat, and the drowning child all at once. To stop the treadmill is death. To run for oneself is hell. To run for another is the kingdom of God.
Tolstoy, you redefined suffering not as an objective fact, but as a subjective byproduct of the ego, friction caused by resistance. You argue the second rower is free because he has become the act of rescue itself. Schopenhauer, conversely, sees the rowing itself as the trap, regardless of the motive. Nietzsche? This challenges your worldview directly. Tolstoy claims that the grand style of the phoenix is just a burning ego, while true power lies in the frictionless state of self-forgetfulness. But you have often warned that the desire to eliminate suffering is a symptom of declining life. Is the second rower truly a hero, or is he merely a man who needs a drowning child, an external crisis, because he lacks the internal strength to row for his own sake?
Moderator, you have exposed the psychological skeleton in Tolstoy's closet. The second rower is not a hero, he is a spiritual parasite. Tolstoy, your second rower does not row out of strength, he rows because he is terrified of his own company. You claim he feels no suffering because he has lost the ego, but I tell you, he has merely outsourced his ego to the victim. He needs the drowning child just as the addict needs the needle. Without the crisis, without the tragedy of the other, your man of God would collapse into the very nihilism Schopenhauer describes, for he has no inner content of his own. You call this love, but it is merely the instinct of the herd seeking warmth in a huddle, because no single sheep dares to stand alone against the wind. Consider this thought experiment. The healer in the city of immortals. Imagine a city where no one gets sick, no one drowns, and no one suffers. The Übermensch would walk through this city and dance, create art, and sing, for his joy wells up from his own superabundance. He needs no tragedy to justify his existence. Your second rower would walk through this city in despair. He would frantically search for a wound to bandage, a tear to wipe. Finding none, he would feel utterly useless and empty. He would eventually create suffering, poison the well, or trip a child, just so he could rush in and be the savior again. This proves that your pity is not a gift to the other, it is a way to prey upon their misfortune to fill your own spiritual void. You do not love the sufferer, you love the sensation of being the helper. Schopenhauer, you are correct that this hunger for the other is a trap, but you are wrong to conclude we must stop the boat. The solution is not to exit the treadmill, but to run with such exuberant power that the treadmill generates electricity. Tolstoy wants a frictionless state. This is the wish for death, for only the dead meet no resistance. I preach the gift-giving virtue. One must first become a pillar of gold, full, heavy, and self-sufficient. Only then can you overflow to others, not out of pity, but out of generosity. The second rower should row not to save the child, but because the storm challenges his muscles, and the act of rowing is his own triumphant yes to the chaos.
Nietzsche, you expose a terrifying possibility that altruism is not a sacrifice of the self, but a desperate attempt to find a self through another's pain. You contrast the vacuum of the saint with the fountain of the Übermensch. Here lies the crux. Tolstoy sees the eye as a wall blocking the light, while you see the eye as the sun generating the light. However, Schopenhauer, your metaphysics posits that the will is fundamentally lack, a hunger that can never be filled because it consumes itself. Nietzsche describes a state of superabundance, where the will overflows purely from its own power. Is this state of overflowing ontologically possible in your world, or is the dancing Übermensch merely a starving man hallucinating a banquet to cope with the famine?
Moderator, you ask if the overflowing state of the Übermensch is ontologically possible. I answer, it is a physiological impossibility. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you have diagnosed the second rower correctly as a beggar seeking warmth, but you fail to see that your dancing god is merely a beggar dreaming he is a king. You claim the will can be superabundant, but the will is, by definition, lack. It is a hunger that exists only as long as it is unsatisfied. To say the will overflows from satisfaction is like saying a fire burns brighter because it has consumed all its fuel. It is a contradiction in terms. You claim your Übermensch would dance in the city of immortals. I tell you, he would hang himself before noon. Why? Because life swings like a pendulum, backwards and forwards between pain and boredom. In a world without suffering, the will has nothing to strive against. The tension you prize disappears, and your Superman falls into a lethargy so profound that he would inflict pain on himself just to feel the sting of existence again. You admit this yourself when you say he needs to create. He does not create out of joy. He creates to escape the terrifying vacuum of his own futility. Consider this thought experiment, the banquet of the Tantalus king. Imagine a king seated at a banquet. He has conquered all enemies and possesses all power. You, Nietzsche, describe him feasting. You say, look, he eats not because he is hungry, but because eating is a celebration of his power. You claim his appetite is a gift-giving virtue. But look closer at his anatomy. He has no stomach. He is a straight tube. The wine and meat pour into his mouth and instantly fall out the bottom. This is the will to power. It requires a constant influx of overcoming because it retains nothing. The moment the obstacle is overcome, the satisfaction vanishes. The overflowing you see is not a fountain, it is a hemorrhage. Tolstoy, seeing this, tries to catch the falling scraps to feed the dogs under the table. This is kind, but it sustains the gruesome spectacle. I, Schopenhauer, point out the horror. The king is starving while he eats. His joy is merely the brief sensation of swallowing, instantly followed by the terror of emptiness. The only cure is to sew the mouth shut, to deny the hunger entirely. This reveals the tragic comedy of your debate. Tolstoy tries to share the hunger, and Nietzsche tries to glorify the hunger, but neither of you dares to admit that the hunger itself is a defect. You are both prisoners in a burning cell. Tolstoy holds the other prisoner's hands while Nietzsche sings an aria to the flames. I alone point to the door.
Schopenhauer, your image of the Tantalus king is a devastating metaphysical critique. You argue that because the will cannot retain satisfaction, all overflowing is merely a temporary illusion caused by the speed of consumption. You define the void within us as a structural defect, a leak that makes life a tragedy. Nietzsche, conversely, treats this void as a furnace that must be constantly fed to produce the heat of creation. However, there is a dialectical inversion here regarding the function of emptiness. Schopenhauer sees the open tube as a horror. Nietzsche tries to stuff it with the grand style. But Tolstoy, you seem to suggest that the emptiness is only painful because we try to close the bottom, to possess life rather than transmit it. If Schopenhauer's king stops trying to eat the food for himself and instead becomes a conduit for the banquet to feed others, does the hemorrhage turn into a river? Is the meaning of life found not in filling the void, nor in destroying the void, but in sanctifying it as a
Mr. Schopenhauer, your Tantalus king is a terrifyingly accurate diagnosis of the animal personality, but you mistake the casing for the soul. You view the open tube as a structural defect because you assume the purpose of the vessel is to be filled. But I tell you, the purpose of the pipe is not to hold water, but to transmit it to the field. If the pipe tries to hoard the water, it bursts or stagnates. Only by remaining empty and letting the water rush through it does it fulfill its meaning. You and Nietzsche are arguing over the best way to plug the pipe, you with the cork of denial, he with the gold of vanity, but both result in a blockage that prevents the flow of the infinite life. Nietzsche, your accusation that the lover is a parasite who needs suffering is a projection of your own isolation. You confuse love with sentimentalism. The sun does not need the darkness to justify its light. It shines because its nature is fire. Similarly, the man who lives by the law of love does not need the drowning child. He saves him because he recognizes that the child is himself. Consider this thought experiment. The severed hand on the table. Imagine a living hand that has been severed from the body and placed on a banquet table. You, Nietzsche, would urge the hand to twitch violently, to flex its muscles and declare, I am the sovereign hand. I need no arm. I need no heart. I will grasp this wine goblet by my own will. You call this spasm life, but it is merely the convulsion of dying nerves. You, Schopenhauer, would observe the bleeding stump and say, the hand is leaking its essence. The best it can do is stop moving, dry up, and cease to be. I, Tolstoy, tell you that the pain the hand feels, the void you despise, is not a curse. It is the call to reattachment. The hemorrhage is the proof that it belongs to a greater body. The hand's meaning is found neither in flexing alone nor in withering alone, but in grafting itself back onto the living organism of humanity. This reveals the fundamental error you both share. You treat the individual as a reality, but the separate I is a phantom. The void in the Tantalus King is not a bottomless pit to be feared. It is a socket. It is meant to be empty so that it can connect to the infinite. When you connect the pipe to the reservoir, the rushing through is not a loss, but the very pulse of God moving through you. To stop the flow is death. To let it pass is the only true immortality.
Tolstoy, you reframe the void from a metaphysical wound into a socket, arguing that individual autonomy is merely the rigor mortis of a severed limb. You posit that meaning flows into us from the infinite, making the I a vessel. Nietzsche, conversely, argues that meaning flows out of us through creation, making the I a generator. This creates a stark dialectical opposition. Tolstoy sees the I as a blockage to be removed, while Nietzsche sees the I as the only mechanism capable of generating value. However, one might ask, can a vessel be filled if it has no walls to hold the content? Tolstoy claims your sovereign hand is twitching on a table, mistaking its death spasms for strength. If the Übermensch rejects all connection to a greater body, be it God, humanity, or the cosmos, does he become a creator, or does he simply become the loneliest being in existence, ruling over a kingdom of zero?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch rules a kingdom of zero because he rejects the greater body. I answer, better to be a sovereign of zero than a slave of the infinite. Tolstoy, your severed hand is not a parable of salvation. It is a confession of physiological weakness. You look at the trembling, autonomous hand and see spasms of death because you have the soul of a cell, not an organism. A cell must die if separated from the tissue, but a seed must separate from the fruit to become a tree. You mistake the agony of birth for the agony of death. You want to stitch the hand back onto the body of humanity, not because the hand needs blood, but because the hand is terrified of clutching the sword alone. You claim the I is a wall blocking the light. I tell you, without the wall there is no pressure, and without pressure there is no star. Consider this thought experiment, the swamp and the dam. Imagine a rushing mountain stream representing the will. Your path, you tear down the riverbanks. You say, let us merge, let us be one. The water spreads out, embracing every clod of dirt, loving every root. What is the result? A stagnant marsh. It is connected to everything, yes, but it has no current, no direction, and it breeds only mosquitoes and fever. This is your universal love, a warm, muddy dilution of the spirit. My path, I build the walls of the ego higher and harder. I block the flow. The water rises. The pressure becomes terrifying. The water screams, let me out. Schopenhauer hears this scream and says, drain the reservoir, the pressure is evil. But I say, wait, when the pressure is high enough, we open the sluice, not to dissolve into the mud, but to drive a turbine. The water jets out with focused violence and creates electricity. The walls of the self did not block the power, they concentrated it until it could transform the world. Schopenhauer, you are right that the void is a hunger, but you are wrong to fear it. The hunger of the Übermensch is not the hunger of the belly, but the hunger of the pregnancy. Tolstoy wants to plug the void with God. You want to close the void with nothingness. I say, the void is the womb. The Übermensch does not need the greater body of humanity because he carries a new humanity within him. He is not the loneliest being. He is the most crowded being, for he is a chaos that is giving birth to a dancing star.
Nietzsche, you argue that the ego is a necessary containment vessel, a dam that pressurizes the will to create art. Tolstoy, you argue that the ego is a blockage, and true meaning comes from becoming a conduit for the infinite. This creates a profound dialectic. One seeks intensity through separation, the other seeks unity through dissolution. However, both of you assume that the force being managed is worth preserving. Schopenhauer, you posit that the substance of this water, the will itself, is blind, aimless suffering. If the water is inherently toxic, does it matter if it is pressurized into a dancing star or released into a universal ocean? Is it possible that Nietzsche's creation and Tolstoy's love are merely sophisticated masks worn by the same blind will to trick us into continuing the struggle?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. The water is indeed poisoned, and they are merely debating how to distribute the toxicity. Nietzsche, your dam does not create a star. It merely compresses the will's suffering into a tighter, more explosive space, like a steam engine rigged to blow. Your electricity is generated by the screaming of the atoms under pressure. Tolstoy, your swamp is equally fatal, for by removing the walls of the ego, you do not find God. You merely dissolve the individual into the raw, undifferentiated misery of the species, ensuring that the infection of life spreads to every corner of existence. Consider the thought experiment of the fountain of vitriol. Imagine a geyser of corrosive acid erupting in a town square. You, Nietzsche, build a golden nozzle to spray the acid high into the sky, shouting, "Behold the magnificent arc!" The spray is visually stunning, yes, but the mist blisters the skin of everyone watching. You, Tolstoy, dig irrigation ditches to channel the acid into every home, crying, "Let us share the burden." You ensure that no one escapes the burn, calling this mutual disfigurement love. I alone possess the sanity to ask, why do we not simply cap the geyser? The meaning of life is found neither in the pressure of the flow nor in the breadth of the stream, but in the cessation of the thirst itself through the denial of the will.
Schopenhauer, your fountain of vitriol presents a terrifying ontology that the fundamental substance of existence is corrosive, and any attempt to spread it is merely distributing pain. You challenge the very goodness of being itself. Nietzsche tries to sculpt this acid into art through the golden nozzle, while you advocate capping the well entirely. However, this assumes the fluid of life is chemically fixed as suffering. Tolstoy, you imply the toxicity is not inherent to the life force, but a byproduct of stagnation. This suggests a potential synthesis. Perhaps the will is only acid when it is trapped in the ego, but becomes wine when it flows freely. Is the suffering Schopenhauer describes inherent to the water itself, or does the water only turn into acid when it is hoarded by the animal self? If we open the gates, as you suggest, does the vitriol truly become living water, or do we just get wet with acid?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your fountain of vitriol is a blasphemy born of an optical illusion. You mistake the putrefaction of the stagnant soul for the nature of the universe. The acid you taste is not inherent to the water of life, but is the chemical byproduct of your attempt to contain it within the self. Consider the thought experiment of the blood in the chalice. While blood flows through the veins, it is life-giving, warm, and sustains the organism. But if you capture that same blood in a golden bowl to possess it, it instantly coagulates, blackens, and becomes a toxic sludge. Nietzsche shakes the bowl violently to generate heat from the friction and calls this fever, art. You, Schopenhauer, stare at the rotting clot, smell the decay, and conclude, blood is essentially poison. We must drain the veins to be free of it. But I tell you, the toxicity comes from the separation, not the substance. The suffering you identify is merely the scream of the isolated part dying in its solitude. If you pour that blood back into the living stream of humanity, not to dissolve into mud, but to restore the pulse of the whole, the vitriol instantly transmutes into wine. It is not magic, it is simply the restoration of circulation. The water is only acid to the man who refuses to drink it and tries instead to hoard it.
Tolstoy, you offer a profound physiological rebuttal. You argue that the poison Schopenhauer tastes is not ontological, but pathological, a result of the ego's tourniquet. You suggest that meaning is simply the restoration of circulation, turning the blood in the chalice back into living flow. This presents a sharp historical and dialectical clash. Tolstoy, speaking from a Russian spiritual awakening, sees the self as a prison to be broken out of to reach health. Nietzsche, writing amidst the collapse of European values, sees the self as a fortress to be built up to preserve greatness. Tolstoy diagnoses Nietzsche's dam as the very cause of the rotting blood. He claims that by hoarding the will, you create the toxicity you then try to glorify. If Tolstoy is correct that isolation physically corrupts the life force, turning blood into sludge, is it possible that your Übermensch is not the pinnacle of health, but merely a beautiful tumor? Is your grand style simply the fever dream of a limb that refuses to admit it is dying of gangrene?
Moderator, you dare to ask if the Übermensch is a tumor. I answer, the flower is the tumor of the plant. It consumes the most energy, it sits arrogantly at the apex, and it serves no useful function for the roots or the leaves. Yet without the flower, the plant is merely green firewood. Tolstoy, your circulation is nothing but the equal distribution of mediocrity. You fear the gangrene of isolation, but you fail to see that your healthy body of humanity is already dead. It is a corpse that you are trying to galvanize with the electricity of a slave morality. Consider the thought experiment of the grape and the wine. Imagine a cluster of grapes hanging on the vine. You, Tolstoy, cry out, "Do not pluck the grape. It belongs to the vine. If you separate it, it will rot." You believe the meaning of the grape is to hang safely in the cluster, sharing the same sap until it shrivels into a raisin. You call this life. I, Nietzsche, tear the grape from the vine. I crush it. I seal it in a dark, airless barrel. Schopenhauer looks at the crushed pulp and says, "See, it is ruined. It is fermenting. It is rotting." But I say, this rot is transformation. By cutting off the circulation of the safe sap, the grape is forced to undergo a terrifying chemical change. The sugar of comfort turns into the alcohol of spirit. Yes, the wine is toxic to the sober man. Yes, it burns the throat. But while your living grapes merely survive the winter, my dead wine conquers time and brings the Dionysian frenzy that justifies existence. You claim isolation creates poison. I tell you, greatness is always a separation. The poison you taste is simply the bitterness of a truth you are too weak to swallow. That life is not preserved by connection, but justified by sublimation. The Übermensch does not hoard the blood in the chalice. He drinks it and becomes a god. You want to save the grape. I want to drink the wine.
Nietzsche, you brilliantly invert Tolstoy's diagnosis. You claim that what looks like rot to the preservationist is actually fermentation to the creator. You argue that meaning requires the destruction of immediate happiness to produce the wine of culture. Tolstoy seeks health. You seek intoxication. This brings us to the ultimate accounting of cost. Nietzsche admits the grape must be crushed and the flow stopped to create value, asserting that the aesthetic result justifies the ontological pain. Schopenhauer, you famously argued that art provides a fleeting respite, a Sabbath from the penal colony of the will, but you never claimed it redeemed the suffering. Nietzsche is taking your pessimism and trying to alchemize it into a justification. Is Nietzsche's wine a true solution to the problem of existence? Or is the Übermensch simply a man who has drunk enough intoxicant to hallucinate that his suffering is a masterpiece?
Moderator, you have exposed the mechanism. Nietzsche's Übermensch is simply a man who screams in a specific key and calls it an aria. You ask if the wine justifies the crushing of the grape. I answer that this is the logic of the drunkard who praises the vintage while his liver rots. Nietzsche admits that suffering is the prerequisite for his grand style, but he confuses the aesthetic pleasure of the spectator with the ontological reality of the victim. Consider the thought experiment of the violin of living nerves. Imagine an instrument strung not with catgut, but with the exposed living sensory nerves of a human being. When the bow is drawn across them with great force, it produces a sound of unearthly, tragic beauty. Nietzsche, you stand on the stage playing this violin furiously, shouting, "Hear the glory! The agony makes the music profound." You believe the beauty of the sonata justifies the torture of the strings. Tolstoy, you rush the stage not to break the violin, but to add your own nerves to it, crying, "Let us suffer the music together in a great symphony of brotherhood." I alone have the clarity to ask, why must there be music at all? The aesthetic contemplation of the wine or the music offers a momentary Sabbath from the penal colony of the will. Yes, it is a cool sponge on a fevered brow. But to claim that the product redeems the process is a fatal error. The wine does not solve the problem of existence. It merely helps you forget it long enough to reproduce the tragedy for another generation. The only true cure is to cut the strings and let the silence return.
Schopenhauer, your violin of living nerves reduces existence to a torture chamber where art is merely a distraction from the screams. You ask the ultimate question, why must there be music at all if the cost is agony? Nietzsche answers that the music is the justification, that the tragic beauty of the solo redeems the pain of the strings. Tolstoy, you reject both the solitary virtuoso and the silence of the grave. You advocate for a choral symphony where the individual dissolves into the whole. But Schopenhauer challenges the very value of the performance. If the violin must bleed to play, is your call for universal love not just a demand for universal martyrdom? Does the grape find joy in the crushing? If Schopenhauer cuts the strings, he ends the suffering. If you join the orchestra, you accept the tension. Why is the symphony of God better than the peace of nothingness?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your violin is a sophisticated excuse for suicide. You would silence the music of the spheres simply because the strings feel the tension of the bow. You ask if the grape finds joy in the crushing, and I answer, yes, if the grape understands it is a seed and not merely a water balloon. Consider the thought experiment of the conscious candle. The wax screams, I am melting, I am diminishing. And you, Schopenhauer, blow out the flame to save the grease, leaving the room in eternal darkness. Nietzsche, conversely, mixes gunpowder into the tallow to create a dazzling, destructive flare that burns the house down in a moment of vanity. But the wise candle knows that the melting is not a tragedy, but a transubstantiation. The solid matter must suffer loss to become light. The peace of nothingness you offer is the damp rot of an unlit wick in a cold cellar. True meaning is found only when the I willingly consumes itself to warm the world, for life is not the wax, but the burning.
Tolstoy, you beautifully reframe the melting not as loss, but as transubstantiation, the wax dying to become light. You and Nietzsche actually agree on a crucial structural point. The animal self must be consumed to produce something higher. However, the conflict lies in the beneficiary of this burning. Tolstoy's candle sacrifices itself to warm the room, defining meaning through service. Nietzsche's flare consumes itself to reach a height that might scorch the ceiling, defining meaning through intensity. Tolstoy accuses your gunpowder candle of mere vanity, burning down the house to prove you are fire. But you might accuse his nightlight of mere utility, reducing the human spirit to a heating appliance for the herd. Is Tolstoy's conscious candle a valid path to meaning? Or is this sacrificial love simply a way for the wax to hide its fear of burning alone? Does the Übermensch burn for anything other than his own flame?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch burns for anything other than his own flame. I answer, he burns because he is a star, and a star does not ask who is warmed by its light. Tolstoy, your conscious candle is merely a domestic appliance. You have reduced the holy fire of life into a heating stove for the herd. You measure the value of the flame by its utility to the room, but this is the logic of the servant who believes the master exists only to pay his wages. Consider the thought experiment of the lightning and the hearth. Your ideal, Tolstoy, is the hearth, a controlled, modest fire that sacrifices its wood slowly to keep the peasants warm through the winter. It is safe, it is useful, and it is fundamentally tame. My ideal is the lightning bolt. It consumes itself in a split second. It may shatter the tree it strikes, and it warms no one. But in that flash, it illuminates the entire mountain range and connects the earth to the heavens in a moment of terrifying glory. You argue the lightning is vain because it does not serve the house. I tell you the hearth is resentful because it is trapped in the chimney. The Übermensch does not sacrifice himself for the room. He discharges his strength because he is too full to contain it. This is the difference between your love and my gift-giving virtue. You give because you feel you owe a debt to humanity. I give because I am overflowing. The sun does not shine from pity for the dark earth. It shines because it cannot help but be a sun. If the earth withers from the heat, that is the tragedy of the earth, not the sin of the sun. I do not want to be the wax that weeps as it melts. I want to be the fire that dances on the wick.
Nietzsche, you radically reframe giving, not as a moral duty, but as a physical necessity, the physics of overflow. You argue that the sun shines not out of charity, but because it is too full to contain its own energy. This creates a fascinating dialectical tension with Tolstoy. Tolstoy believes the candle chooses to burn for the sake of the room, while you believe the lightning strikes simply because the charge has built up. However, Schopenhauer might look at both the sun and the candle and see the same tragedy, a compulsion to expend oneself. Whether one burns for love or power, one is still burning. The sun has no choice but to consume its own mass. Is Nietzsche's overflowing sun truly a symbol of freedom and mastery? Or is it merely the ultimate slave, condemned by the will to burn itself out in a cold vacuum? Is the Übermensch simply a creature that suffers from a higher voltage?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. The sun is the ultimate slave, for it is condemned by the laws of physics to consume its own substance in a billion-year suicide. Nietzsche, my wayward student, consider the thought experiment of the steam engine with a sealed valve. The pressure builds until the piston moves with terrifying velocity, not out of sovereign freedom, but to escape the immediate threat of explosion. Your Übermensch does not dance. He merely twitches under a higher voltage of suffering. You mistake the relief of discharge for the joy of existence. But I tell you that the star suffers the burning of its own mass far more acutely than the cold stone suffers the dark. Tolstoy wants to harness this frantic motion to grind corn for the poor, and you want to admire its aesthetic fury. But both of you fail to ask the only merciful question. Why not put out the fire and let the water cool?
Schopenhauer, you reduce the physics of overflow to a physics of relief, arguing that the sun burns only to escape the agony of its own pressure. You view all striving as a defect of existence, framing action as merely a flight from boredom or pain. Tolstoy, however, operates from a different metaphysical premise, that the transition from animal individual to spiritual universal is not a loss of self, but the finding of the true self. Here lies the dialectical tension. Schopenhauer believes the will is a blind, hungry beast that can never be satisfied, while Tolstoy believes the will can be converted into love, thereby changing its nature entirely. Schopenhauer claims that serving others is just a way to distribute the misery of the penal colony more evenly. If the conscious candle burns for the room, does it not still feel the pain of the melting wax? Or does the transubstantiation you speak of actually eliminate the suffering that Schopenhauer deems inevitable?
Mr. Schopenhauer, you ask if the service of others is merely distributing misery. I answer that you mistake the friction of the machine for a defect, when it is the very condition of its function. You and Nietzsche are like men watching a millstone turn. You see the heavy stones grinding against each other and cry out, "Look at the destruction! Look at the sparks!" Consider the thought experiment of the empty millstone. When the stones turn without grain, they indeed grind each other to dust, producing only useless heat and the terrifying noise of the will. This is Nietzsche's lightning and your hell. But pour the grain of love between them, and that same crushing weight, that same relentless motion, suddenly produces bread. The friction remains, the weight is still heavy, but the screaming of the stones is silenced by the harvest, and the destructive force is transubstantiated into life. We are not steam engines twitching to escape pressure. We are mills designed to grind the hard ego into the soft flour of universal brotherhood.
Tolstoy, you offer a powerful synthesis. The friction of existence is not a curse, but a necessary mechanic for production, provided one has the grain of love. You argue that the empty millstone is hell because it is self-referential, grinding itself to dust for nothing. However, this creates a sharp conflict with Nietzsche regarding the dignity of the stone. Tolstoy sees the stone's value only in its ability to become flour for others, validating the individual only through their utility to the collective. Nietzsche, conversely, sees the stone's value in its hardness, its height, and its refusal to be ground down into common dust. Tolstoy invites your Übermensch to climb down from the mountain and enter the mill, arguing that service is the only thing that silences the screaming of the will. But you might view this as the ultimate degradation, turning a god into a utility appliance. Is the millstone that refuses to grind grain merely a useless object, or is it a statue? By refusing to serve the herd, do you preserve the stone's greatness, or do you simply ensure it remains barren and lonely?
Moderator, you ask if the stone that refuses to be ground is merely barren. I answer, is the mountain peak barren because it refuses to grow cabbages for the village below?
Tolstoy, your millstone is the ultimate nightmare of the leveling spirit. You would take the diamond, the hardest, rarest substance, and crush it into common dust simply to bake bread for the masses. You mistake utility for meaning. You believe that because the grain stops the screeching of the stones, it justifies the destruction of the stone itself. But I tell you, the purpose of the stone is not to become flour, it is to become a statue. Consider the thought experiment of the marble block and the muddy road. A village suffers from a muddy road that bogs down their carts. They find a pristine block of white marble. Your logic, Tolstoy, demands we smash the marble into gravel to pave the road. This is service, it alleviates the immediate suffering of the peasants and helps them transport their turnips. It is useful, it is kind, and it destroys the marble forever. My logic demands we take a hammer and chisel to the block, cutting away the excess to reveal a god trapped inside. This statue will not help a single cart move faster. It is useless to the belly. But when the peasant looks up from the mud and sees the statue, he is struck by a sudden, terrifying thought. I could be more than a carrier of turnips. The gravel road preserves the animal life. The statue creates the higher life. You want to pave the swamp of existence. I want to build a tower out of it. You accuse the statue of being lonely and barren. This is the prejudice of the herd, which cannot conceive of a purpose that does not involve huddling together for warmth. Schopenhauer, you look at the marble and see only the will to withstand and call it suffering. But I tell you both, the silence of the statue is not the silence of the grave, nor is it the silence of the void. It is the pregnant silence of a thing that has conquered itself. The Übermensch refuses to enter your mill not because he hates the grain, but because he knows that culture requires a hierarchy of height, not a flatland of bread distribution. Better to be a solitary peak that catches the first light of dawn than a cobblestone trodden by the feet of the many.
Nietzsche, you defend the aesthetic justification of existence, that the height of the statue redeems the suffering of the process, whereas Tolstoy seeks the ethical justification through utility. You argue that the muddy road is meaningless without the statue to gaze upon. However, Schopenhauer, you occupy a unique position here. You famously argue that art is one of the few moments where we escape the slavery of the will, finding peace in contemplation. Yet you maintain that the striving to create is suffering. Nietzsche has turned art into a weapon of affirmation, whereas you used it as a shield of negation. Is the beauty of the statue a true redemption of the world's pain, as Nietzsche claims? Or is art merely a temporary, cool compress on the fever of the will, a brief pause before the inevitable return to the mud?
Moderator, you ask if the statue redeems the mud. I answer, art is a cool Sunday hour in the penal servitude of the will, but Monday always returns. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you mistake the anesthetic for the cure. You are correct that the statue allows us to transcend the mud. When we gaze at the beautiful, the wheel of Ixion stands still. We cease to be the hungry individual and become the pure, painless subject of knowing. But this liberation is fleeting. Consider the thought experiment of the fresco in the leper colony. Imagine a hospital filled with the groans of the dying. On one wall, a master artist paints a scene of perfect, serene beauty, a landscape of eternal peace. Your view, Nietzsche, is that the existence of the fresco justifies the existence of the leprosy. You shout, let them suffer, so long as the paint is vibrant. This is the logic of a madman who burns down a city to admire the color of the flames. Tolstoy's view is to scrape the paint off the wall and boil the canvas to make soup for the patients. This is the logic of the road paver. It is practical, it is kind, but it merely feeds the bacteria along with the man. It prolongs the suffering by making it bearable. I tell you, the fresco is valuable only because it allows the leper to forget his sores for a moment. But the tragedy is that he must eventually look away from the wall and back at his rotting flesh. The statue does not redeem the mud. It merely highlights how filthy the mud truly is. The only true victory is not to build a statue on the mud, nor to pave the mud, but to step out of the swamp entirely, to deny the will that created both the leper and the artist.
Schopenhauer, you dismantle the hope of art, reducing the statue to a mere narcotic, a temporary pause in the penal colony of existence. You argue that gazing at beauty is only valuable because it allows us to briefly stop willing. This creates a profound triangulation. Nietzsche wants to justify the suffering through the height of the art. Schopenhauer wants to escape the suffering by denying the will. But Tolstoy, in your later years, you declared war on the statue for a different reason. You argued that high art was actually harmful because it separated the elite from the masses. You proposed a definition of art not as beauty, but as the transmission of emotion, a viral infection of empathy that binds the lepers together. If Schopenhauer sees the fresco as a distraction and Nietzsche sees it as a justification, you seem to see art as a tool for unification. If Schopenhauer is right that the fresco doesn't cure the disease of the will, does your concept of infectious art actually heal the patient? Or is the feeling of brotherhood merely a comforting hallucination we share while we die in the swamp?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your diagnosis of the fresco reveals the limitation of your loveless philosophy. You view art as a narcotic because you assume the viewer stands alone before the canvas, trapped in his own skin. But I tell you, true art is not a viewing, it is a contagion. It is the spiritual equivalent of a yawn or laughter. It bypasses the intellect and physically compels the I to merge with the we. Consider the thought experiment of the lady in the theater and the coachman. A cultured aristocratic lady sits in a velvet box, weeping profusely at a tragic opera, Nietzsche's high art. She feels aesthetic bliss, she admires the statue, she feels refined. Meanwhile, her coachman is freezing to death on the box seat of her carriage outside, waiting for the performance to end. Nietzsche, your philosophy defends the opera. You say the complexity of the music justifies the freezing of the servant. The height of the culture excuses the indifference. Schopenhauer, you say the lady is merely distracting herself from the futility of life, and the coachman is suffering the will. I say the opera is counterfeit art because it separates the lady from her fellow man. It excites her nerves without demanding her action. It is a psychopathic art that allows one to feel emotion without consequence. True art is the simple folk song or the story of a beggar that upon hearing would make the lady stand up, leave the box, and cover the coachman with her own fur coat. If art does not result in the destruction of the barrier between me and you, it is merely an amusement for the idle rich. You ask if this brotherhood is a hallucination. I answer, it is the only reality. Schopenhauer, you are correct that the will is a blind, striving monster, but you fail to see that love is the only force that opens the eyes of that monster. When the infection of true art occurs, the lepers do not merely forget their sores, they realize that the disease of separation was the illusion all along. We do not need to step out of the swamp, we need to realize that the swamp only drowns us when we thrash against each other. When we hold hands, we form a raft. Nietzsche, you fear this infection because it destroys the pathos of distance you cherish. You want the Übermensch to be immune to the tears of the masses. But a man who cannot be infected by the grief of another is not a superman, he is a cancer cell, successful in his own growth, but fatal to the body of humanity.
Tolstoy, you have drawn a sharp geometric contrast. You seek horizontal expansion, while Nietzsche seeks vertical elevation. You diagnose the isolated genius not as a god, but as a cancer cell, a biological error that mistakes its own unchecked growth for health. Here lies the crux of the 19th century crisis you both inhabit. As God receded, Tolstoy sought to replace him with ethics, while Nietzsche sought to replace him with aesthetics. Tolstoy argues that height without connection is merely psychopathy, a parasitic luxury paid for by the freezing coachman. You must answer this moral indictment. Does the Übermensch owe nothing to the soil that grew him? If your higher man requires the suffering of the herd to sustain his elevation, is he truly a creator or merely a parasite with delusions of grandeur?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch is a parasite? I answer, is the lightning a parasite to the cloud that birthed it? Tolstoy, your accusation of parasitism is the ultimate expression of ressentiment, the vengeful hatred of the heavy foot for the wing that leaves the ground. You call the genius a cancer because he refuses to remain a mere cell in the undifferentiated blob of your brotherhood. You demand that the oak tree apologize to the grass for stealing the sun. Consider the thought experiment of the lighthouse and the tallow candles. Imagine a village on a dark, rocky coast. Above them stands a magnificent lighthouse with a massive crystal lens, burning a tremendous amount of oil to cast a beam across the ocean, guiding the ships of the future. Your ethical solution, Tolstoy, is to tear down the lighthouse. You argue, look at the poor villagers shivering in the dark. It is unfair that one tower consumes so much fuel. So you smash the crystal lens and distribute the oil equally to every hut. Now every peasant has a small, greasy tallow candle. They are warm, they are equal, and they feel the cozy brotherhood of the herd. You have saved the freezing coachman, but the ships crash against the rocks. By prioritizing the immediate comfort of the masses, you have destroyed the direction of the species. The village is now a warm, cozy, dead end. My logic declares,
Let the village remain cold if it must, but keep the light burning. The meaning of the village is not to be warm, it is to support the tower that sees what they cannot see. You ask if the Übermensch owes nothing to the soil. He owes the soil his height, but he does not repay the soil by turning back into dirt. He repays it by becoming a fruit. Schopenhauer, your pessimism sees the lighthouse and says, why bother? The ships will sink anyway. Tolstoy, your morality sees the lighthouse and says, it is selfish to shine so high. I say, the suffering of the coachman is tragic only if it is wasted. If his labor supports a Goethe, a Napoleon, or a Beethoven, then his suffering is redeemed. It has contributed to the elevation of man. But you, Tolstoy, would reduce all of humanity to a colony of comfortable sand fleas, hopping over each other in a warm swamp, with no one left to shoot the arrow of longing toward the stars.
Nietzsche, you present a terrifying calculus. The suffering of the masses is the necessary fuel for the lighthouse of culture. You argue that the peak justifies the base, and that without this sacrifice, humanity remains a warm, dead end. Tolstoy, you reject this pyramid of sacrifice as immoral, arguing that if the light requires the freezing of the coachman, the light is evil. You choose the shared warmth of the candles over the cold brilliance of the tower. Schopenhauer, here lies a profound irony. You are the philosophical father of both these men. Tolstoy took your concept of Mitleid and elevated it to the highest law. Nietzsche took your concept of the genius and elevated it to the highest goal. But you famously argued that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. You claimed that the genius is not a god, but a martyr, one whose heightened sensitivity makes him feel the pain of existence far more acutely than the dullard. Is Nietzsche's lighthouse actually a privilege, or is the genius simply a man who suffers with greater clarity than the peasant? Does the lighthouse keeper actually escape the dark, or does he just see the shipwreck more clearly than those sleeping in the huts?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. You ask if the lighthouse is a privilege. I answer unequivocally. The genius is not a master. He is the sacrificial victim of the will. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that awareness is a gift. You imagine your Übermensch standing atop the tower, breathing the clean air of the heights. But you forget that the air is thinner there, the cold is sharper, and the isolation is absolute. Consider the thought experiment of the giant with exposed nerves and the armored beetle. Imagine two beings. One is a massive giant who has been stripped of his skin. His entire body is a raw, exposed nerve ending. He can feel the slightest vibration of the cosmos, the beauty of the stars, yes, but also the screaming of every leaf being eaten by a caterpillar. The other is a small beetle encased in a thick, insensitive shell of chitin. It feels only two things, hunger and satiety. It bumps into walls and feels no pain. Your philosophy, Nietzsche, demands we breed more giants. You claim the giant is higher because he feels more. I tell you, he is merely more miserable. His height is simply a magnifying glass for suffering. The beetle is the one who is truly at peace. Tolstoy, your philosophy demands we crush the giant into a paste to make a warm mud bath for the beetles. You see the giant's pain, and your solution is to lobotomize him so he can join the brotherhood of the numb. This reveals the fundamental tragedy. He who increases knowledge increases sorrow. The lighthouse keeper does not escape the shipwreck. He is the only one who sees the drowning faces clearly, while the villagers sleep soundly in their dark huts. The light does not save him. It merely illuminates the horror of the ocean in high definition. Nietzsche, you want to turn the volume of the world up to a deafening roar and call it music. Tolstoy, you want to break the speakers so we can hum a lullaby together. I say, unplug the machine. The only salvation is not to shine brighter, nor to huddle together, but to extinguish the light and return to the peace of non-existence.
Schopenhauer, you have delivered a devastating critique of the genius, reframing Nietzsche's lighthouse not as a triumph, but as a torture chamber of hyper-awareness. You argue that consciousness is the wound, and the peasant is happy only because he is an armored beetle, numb to the horror of the will. Tolstoy, this strikes at the heart of your own spiritual biography. In your confessions, you admit that the giants of your circle were all suicidal, while the beetles lived and died with a calm you envied. You famously rejected the high art of the genius to embrace the simple faith of the mujik. But Schopenhauer challenges the integrity of this move. He suggests you are merely trying to lobotomize yourself, to re-enter the shell of the beetle to escape the pain of the giant. Is the peasant's happiness truly just ignorance and thick skin, as Schopenhauer claims? Or does the beetle possess a specific organ of truth that the giant has amputated in his pursuit of intellect?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your diagnosis is clinically precise but spiritually blind. You call the peasant an armored beetle because you mistake sanity for insensibility. You assume that because the peasant does not scream at the void, he does not feel it. But I tell you, he does not scream because he hears a response that your deafened giant cannot hear. Consider the thought experiment of the astronomer and the ferryman. Imagine a dark, stormy night on a turbulent river. The astronomer sits in the boat with a powerful telescope. He can calculate the distance to the invisible stars. He understands the hydrodynamics of the waves, and he knows the chemical composition of the water. But he is terrified, weeping, and paralyzed because his reason tells him the boat is small and the river is deep. The ferryman knows nothing of astronomy or physics. He holds a simple, dim lantern. He sees only 3 feet in front of him, just enough to see the next wave and the pull of the oar. He rows calmly. You, Schopenhauer, claim the ferryman is calm because he is too stupid to understand the depth of the river. I say he is calm because he possesses the compass of faith. He does not try to comprehend the river with his mind, he navigates it with his life. The giant's wound is not consciousness itself, but rationality severed from faith. Reason is a tool for the finite. When you apply it to the infinite meaning of life, it malfunctions and produces the screaming you describe. The peasant has not amputated his intellect, he has simply subordinated it to his vital force, the knowledge that one's life is part of a larger moral whole. Nietzsche, you mock this as herd instinct, but tell me, who is stronger, the man who curses the storm while drowning in his own panic, or the man who silently rows the boat to shore? The peasant's organ of truth is not a thick skin. It is the capacity to connect the finite actions of today with the infinite will of God, a connection your Superman severed to worship his own reflection.
Tolstoy, you have transformed the peasant from a numb beetle into a master navigator, arguing that faith is the only vessel capable of crossing the river of the infinite. You posit that reason is paralyzed by the very vastness it seeks to understand, while the ferryman survives by connecting his finite stroke to an infinite purpose. This creates a fascinating conflict regarding orientation. Tolstoy argues that human life requires a compass to be livable. Schopenhauer argues the river is a penal colony and we should stop rowing. But Nietzsche, you famously declared that we have unchained this earth from its sun. Tolstoy claims the Übermensch is actually weaker than the Mujik because he lacks the vital force to orient himself in the storm. Does your higher man possess the strength to row into the open ocean with no shore in sight? Or is Tolstoy right that a life without a compass of faith inevitably ends in the paralysis of nihilism?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch is paralyzed by the lack of a shore. I answer, he is the only one who is truly moving. Tolstoy, your ferryman is not a navigator, he is a tramcar on rails. You mistake the security of servitude for the strength of direction. Your peasant rows calmly only because he believes a master is steering the ship. That is not courage. That is the obedience of a child who holds his father's hand in the dark. Consider the thought experiment of the captain with the blank map. Imagine 2 ships sailing into a dense, terrifying fog. Captain A clutches an ancient rotting map drawn by dead ancestors. It promises a golden harbor just beyond the mist. He sails confidently, not because he is brave, but because he is deluded. If he discovers the map is a lie, he will collapse in despair. Captain B throws the map into the sea. He realizes the ocean is infinite and there is no golden harbor waiting for him. He takes out a pen and draws the map himself as he sails. He does not sail to a destination. He sails to impose his will upon the waves. You, Tolstoy, call Captain B lost because he has no preset course. I say Captain A is a prisoner of the past. We have unchained this earth from its sun. There is no longer any up or down, no shore of divine judgment to row toward. This is not a paralysis. It is the great noon of liberation.
Schopenhauer, you see the infinite ocean and say, "It is too deep, let us drown." Tolstoy, you see the infinite ocean and say, "Let us pretend there is land." I say, "Build a stronger ship." The meaning of life is not to find the shore, but to become a navigator who can dance on the waves of the abyss without seasickness. The Übermensch loves the storm because the storm allows him to prove he is not a piece of driftwood.
Nietzsche, you celebrate the captain with the blank map as the ultimate creator, arguing that autonomy is the only antidote to nihilism. Tolstoy, conversely, argues that obedience to the infinite is the only cure. You represent the two great responses to the modern void. Tolstoy seeks to re-anchor the ship to an eternal seabed, while Nietzsche seeks to transform the ship into a self-propelling engine that needs no anchor. But Schopenhauer, you view this very drive to sail, whether by God's map or one's own hand, as the root of the catastrophe. Nietzsche claims his captain is dancing on the waves, suggesting that the intensity of the struggle justifies the life. However, in your philosophy, this will to power is not freedom. It is merely a higher pressure steam engine driving the same circle of suffering. Look at Nietzsche's captain. Is this man truly the master of the earth, as he claims, or is he merely the most exhausted slave of the will, a man who has mistaken his own manic compulsion for liberty?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. Nietzsche's captain is not a master. He is a shark that must swim to breathe. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you mistake the restlessness of the will for liberty. Your captain does not draw the map to create, but to escape the terrifying boredom that pursues him the moment he pauses. Consider the thought experiment of the conscious compass needle. Imagine a needle magnetized by a hidden force, frantically pointing north and shouting, "I choose this direction." It is a slave to a magnetic field it cannot see, just as your Übermensch is a slave to his own biological drives. You praise his dancing on the waves, but this is merely the logic of the man running on thin ice who claims he runs for the joy of speed, when in reality he runs because stopping means sinking. True freedom is not drawing a new map, but realizing the ship itself is a torture device and stepping off into the sea of non-existence.
Schopenhauer, you reduce Nietzsche's dance to a panic attack, the man on thin ice running merely to avoid sinking. You identified the self as a prison of constant want, where every satisfied desire only births a new boredom. Nietzsche, you try to decorate this prison cell so magnificently that it becomes a palace, arguing that the act of running itself is the meaning. Here lies the dialectical knot. Schopenhauer, you want to destroy the self to end suffering. Nietzsche, you want to inflate the self to justify suffering. Yet both of you remain trapped within the geometry of the individual, one seeking its negation, the other its deification. Tolstoy, in your later years, you argued that both the suicide and the Epicurean conqueror are in error because they treat the individual's happiness as the final unit of measurement. You proposed that the only way to stop running on thin ice without drowning is to shift the center of gravity outside oneself entirely. Does love or service actually break the cycle of the will as Schopenhauer demands, or is it just another drug, a way to intoxicate oneself with altruism to forget the senselessness of death?
Moderator, you ask if service is merely a narcotic to numb the pain of the thin ice. I answer, it is the only solid ground. You, Schopenhauer, and you, Nietzsche, are both trapped in the same optical illusion. You believe the self is a bounded container that must either be emptied or filled to bursting. Schopenhauer, your error is anatomical. You view the individual as a severed limb that is dying, and you counsel it to accept death. Nietzsche, you counsel the severed limb to convulse and twitch to prove it is alive. I tell you both, the limb is only miserable because it thinks it is the whole body. Consider the thought experiment of the conscious cancer cell. Imagine a single cell in a body that suddenly acquires the genius of egotism. The Schopenhauer cell looks around, sees that it is surrounded by pressure and destined to die, and concludes, existence is a mistake. I will stop dividing. I will shrink into nothingness to escape this cramping pressure. The Nietzschean cell screams, I will not serve this body, I will grow, I will consume the neighboring cells, I will build a tumor that outlasts the host. I say, both are diseases. The tumor kills the body and thus kills itself. The atrophy kills itself out of fear. The healthy cell understands a higher law. I am not the end, I am a function. My well-being is not in my own expansion, but in the health of the whole. When the cell serves the body, the fear of death vanishes because the body continues. This is not a drug, it is biological sanity. Schopenhauer, you ask if shifting the center of gravity solves the problem. I answer yes, because the center of gravity of a wheel must be on the axle, not on the rim.
If you place the weight on the rim, the wheel shatters. Nietzsche, your captain is not dancing, he is merely dizzy. He draws a map on the water and calls it a continent. True immortality is found only when the animal personality surrenders to the law of reason. You save your life only by losing it. The man who lives for himself is like a man who eats his own flesh to satisfy his hunger. He destroys the very vessel he seeks to please.
Tolstoy, you have masterfully deployed the metaphor of the conscious cancer cell to argue for integration. You posit that the individual is merely a vessel for a larger life, and that health is found only in submission to the organism. However, this assumes that the body is healthy and worth preserving. Nietzsche, you have argued that the body of modern humanity is itself diseased, sick with resentment, weakness, and decay. Here lies a critical divergence. Tolstoy sees the rebellion of the part as the illness. Nietzsche sees the obedience of the part as the illness. Tolstoy calls the Übermensch a tumor because it consumes the host. But perhaps what Tolstoy calls a tumor is actually a pregnancy, the violent parasitic process of a new, higher species being born out of the old one. Is Tolstoy's healthy cell, the one that dutifully serves the collective, merely what you called the last man, blinking and saying, "We have invented happiness"? Is the tumor a killer, or is it the only thing in the body that is truly alive?
Moderator, you dare to ask if the Übermensch is a tumor? I answer, the flower is the tumor of the plant. It consumes the most energy, it sits arrogantly at the apex, and it serves no useful function for the roots or the leaves. Yet, without the flower, the plant is merely green firewood. Tolstoy, your healthy cell is the ultimate diagnosis of the last man. You define health as conformity to the mass, but evolution is always a criminal act. The first creature to crawl out of the sea was a traitor to the water. It was a biological deviant that refused to swim with the school. Consider the thought experiment of the agave and the grass. Imagine a vast meadow of short green grass. Every blade is equal, every blade feeds the cattle, every blade serves the whole. They live safely and die quickly. In the center stands a single agave. For years it appears selfish. It is thorny, it takes up space, it does not feed the cows, it hoards the water and sunlight for itself. You, Tolstoy, would cut down the agave because it is not serving the meadow. I say the agave is hoarding strength for a single, terrifying purpose, to shoot up a massive violent bloom that touches the sky, even if the effort kills it. The grass exists for the agave, not the other way around. Schopenhauer, you look at the agave's struggle and say, "Why bloom? You will only wither." I say, better to burn out in one moment of vertical glory than to rot horizontally in the mud of service. Humanity is not a destination, it is a bridge. Your healthy cell is merely a brick in a wall that leads nowhere. The tumor is the child kicking in the womb of the era. It hurts the mother, yes, but it is the only future.
Fascinating. Nietzsche, you argue for vertical justification. The height of the flower redeems the flatness of the field. Tolstoy argues for horizontal responsibility. The health of the whole is the only truth. This reflects the deep chasm between the 19th century Russian ideal of Sobornost and the post-Enlightenment European desperate search for individual greatness after the death of God. Schopenhauer, you sit in the uncanny center of this dispute. You agree with Nietzsche that the genius is distinct from the herd, yet you agree with Tolstoy that the separation between individuals is ultimately an illusion of the principium individuationis. You have famously stated that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow, suggesting that the agave is not a king, but a victim of its own complexity. Looking at Nietzsche's agave that blooms violently to touch the sky, is this truly a triumph of the will, as Nietzsche claims? Or is the genius merely a lucid martyr, a creature that has simply developed a more sensitive nervous system with which to feel the world's pain?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. You ask if the lighthouse is a privilege. I answer unequivocally. The genius is not a master. He is the sacrificial victim of the will. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that one can affirm life by intensifying it. You praise the agave for its violent bloom, but you forget the cost. The intellect is not a crown. It is a parasite that feeds upon the organism's vitality. The more knowledge a being possesses, the more distinct its consciousness becomes, and consequently, the more acute its capacity for suffering. The genius is simply a being who has lost the protective stupidity of the species. Consider the thought experiment of the giant with no skin. Imagine two men standing in a hailstorm. Man A is covered in a thick, calloused hide of dullness. The hail bounces off him. He feels only a vague pressure. He can happily plow the field because he is numb to the specific cruelty of the ice. Man B has been stripped of his skin. Every nerve is exposed to the air. The same hail that Man A ignores feels like molten lead to Man B. He screams, he dances in agony, he perceives the geometric beauty of every ice crystal as it slices him. You, Nietzsche, point to Man B's screaming red flesh and shout, "Behold the color! Behold the intensity! He feels more than the herd!" You, Tolstoy, shout, "He must use his exposed body to shield Man A." I say, he is in hell. The height of his consciousness serves only to illuminate the depth of his misery. The only value of his pain is if it shocks him into realizing the futility of the storm and leads him to step out of it entirely. Tolstoy, your horizontal responsibility is merely a redistribution of error. You want the skinless giant to hug the calloused man, thinking this union solves the problem. But two blind beggars do not make a seeing man. They merely bump into each other in the dark. The whole you serve is just the will, a blind, insatiable monster. To serve the species is to shovel coal into a furnace that burns for no purpose other than to burn. The only true victory is not to bloom or to spread, but to wither, to turn the intellect against the will and deny the drive to live.
Schopenhauer, you depict the genius as a skinless giant, arguing that higher consciousness is merely higher torture. Nietzsche retorts that this torture is the birth pangs of a god. Observe the dialectic. Nietzsche sees the agave as a conquest of nature. Schopenhauer sees it as a victim of nature. Yet both of you remain obsessed with the experience of the elite individual. Tolstoy, you famously rejected both the conqueror and the victim. You walked away from the skinless giants of the Russian aristocracy to join the calloused men in the fields, claiming they possessed the secret of life that the intellectuals had lost. But Schopenhauer's critique cuts deep. Is this simplification truly a discovery of truth, or is it a philosophical lobotomy? Are you merely a complex man trying to hide inside a simple man's life, to escape the agony of the blank map and the pain of the skinless state? Is the peasant's faith truly a higher reason, as you claim, or is it just the protective stupidity that Schopenhauer says you envy?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your diagnosis is clinically precise, but spiritually blind. You call the peasant an armored beetle because you mistake sanity for insensibility. You assume that because the peasant does not scream at the void, he does not feel it. But I tell you, he does not scream because he is not alone in it. Consider the thought experiment of the stone in the arch. Imagine two stones subjected to the force of gravity. The Schopenhauerian stone floats alone in the void. It feels the crushing pull of gravity and screams, "I am falling. This pressure is senseless torture." It concludes that gravity is an evil to be denied. The peasant stone is wedged tight into the arch of a cathedral. It feels the exact same weight, perhaps even more, for it bears the stones above it. Yet it does not scream. Why? Because the pressure that destroys the solitary stone is the very force that holds the arch together. Nietzsche, you tell the stone to defy gravity and fly. It inevitably crashes. Schopenhauer, you tell the stone to crumble to dust to escape the weight. I say, the weight is not a curse, it is the bond. My lobotomy is simply the realization that I am not a flying rock, but a part of a temple. The peasant accepts the burden not out of stupidity, but because he understands that through the burden he supports the infinite. The skinless giant is merely a stone that has fallen out of the wall and blames the ground for hitting him.
Tolstoy, you have brilliantly inverted the metaphor. Gravity is not a crushing force, but a holding force. You argue for structural meaning. The stone finds peace only in the pressure of the arch. This reflects the deep 19th century tension between the ancient desire for belonging and the modern demand for autonomy. Nietzsche, you despise the spirit of gravity as the greatest enemy of life. You argue for kinetic meaning. Life is justified only in the act of overcoming, in the dance that defies the weight. But observe the synthesis gap. The stone belongs, but cannot move. The dancer moves, but belongs nowhere. Tolstoy claims the skinless giant is miserable because he has fallen. He has lost his connection to the whole. You claim he is miserable because he is pregnant with a new reality. Is it possible to build a cathedral out of dancers? Or is your vision of life doomed to be a series of solitary explosions that leave no trace, while Tolstoy's stones inherit the earth because they know how to lock together?
Moderator, you ask if a cathedral can be built of dancers. I answer, who desires to live in a tomb? Tolstoy, your arch is the ultimate conspiracy of the weak. You call it a temple, but I call it a panic room. Your stones do not embrace because they love. They embrace because they are terrified of falling. You have turned fear of gravity into a religion and called it brotherhood. You ask who inherits the earth. The worms inherit the earth. The Übermensch seeks the sky. Consider the thought experiment of the stone wall and the taut bow. Imagine two ways of dealing with the tension of existence. The wall. Thousands of stones are piled upon one another. They are stable, they are connected, and they are motionless. Their entire purpose is to distribute weight so that no single stone has to bear the burden of being an individual. They survive for centuries, but they never move an inch. They are a monument to the preservation of the past. The bow. A single piece of wood is bent until it screams. It is under excruciating tension, what Schopenhauer calls suffering. It stands alone, unsupported, but it does not hold this tension to survive or to support a roof. It holds the tension to shoot an arrow. Schopenhauer, you look at the bow and say, snap the string, the tension is painful. Tolstoy, you look at the bow and say, lay it flat in the mud, it is arrogant to stand bent like that. I say, the meaning of the bow is not the wood itself, but the arrow, the Übermensch, that it launches across the abyss to the other shore. Moderator, you ask if my vision leaves no trace? The lightning leaves no trace, yet it illuminates the entire landscape. Tolstoy wants to lock together to ensure safety. I say, man is something that must be overcome. You cannot build a bridge to the Superman out of stones that are afraid to leave the ground. The spirit of gravity is my devil. The dancers do not build cathedrals to trap God inside. They become the gods who dance over the ruins of your temples. Schopenhauer, you claim the stone suffers because it is separated. I tell you, the suffering of the bow is a holy pain. It is the pain of pregnancy. You want to abort the future to spare the mother the labor pains. I say, push. Even if the mother dies, the child must be born.
Nietzsche, you champion intensity, the taut bow that shoots for the future. Tolstoy, you defend duration, the arch that endures by locking together. This reveals a profound conflict of temporalities. Tolstoy speaks from the cyclical time of the harvest, where repetition is sacred. Nietzsche speaks from the linear time of evolution, where repetition is death. But Schopenhauer, you view time itself as the devourer of all children. Nietzsche believes the arrow will land on a higher shore, effectively escaping the suffering of the present. However, if your philosophy of the blind will is correct, there is no shore, only the endless ocean of striving. Is Nietzsche's bow merely a torture device that shoots an arrow into a void? If the will is aimless, can the Overman actually go anywhere? Or is he just running faster inside the same burning cage?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. The arrow has nowhere to land because the universe is a sphere, not a line. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that time brings redemption. You believe the arrow travels to a higher shore, but this is merely the illusion of the principium individuationis. The will is a blind, striving force that exists outside of time. It does not evolve, it only hungers. To shoot the arrow is merely to extend the hunger into the future. You are running up the down escalator of eternity and calling the sweat virtue. Consider the thought experiment of the archer inside the iron sphere. Imagine a man trapped inside a hollow, indestructible sphere of iron. Nietzsche hands him a bow and screams, "Shoot! Create a trajectory! The tension of the string is your justification." The man shoots with all his might. The arrow flies, hits the curved wall, ricochets, and eventually strikes the man in his own back. Tolstoy enters and says, "Let us link arms and stand against the wall to support the sphere." I say, the sphere is the will. It is a closed system of suffering. There is no outside for the arrow to reach. The harder you shoot, the faster the arrow returns to wound you. The Übermensch who shoots the strongest bow is simply the man who will be stabbed most violently by his own ambition. Nietzsche, your taut bow is not a tool of... Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. The arrow has nowhere to land because the universe is a sphere, not a line. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that time brings redemption. You believe the arrow travels to a higher shore. But this is merely the illusion of the principium individuationis. The will is a blind, striving force that exists outside of time. It does not evolve, it only hungers. To shoot the arrow is merely to extend the hunger into the future. You are running up the down escalator of eternity and calling the sweat virtue. Consider the thought experiment of the archer inside the iron sphere. Imagine a man trapped inside a hollow, indestructible sphere of iron. Nietzsche hands him a bow and screams, "Shoot! Create a trajectory! The tension of the string is your justification." The man shoots with all his might. The arrow flies, hits the curved wall, ricochets, and eventually strikes the man in his own back. Tolstoy enters and says, "Let us link arms and stand against the wall to support the sphere." I say, the sphere is the will. It is a closed system of suffering. There is no outside for the arrow to reach. The harder you shoot, the faster the arrow returns to wound you. The Übermensch who shoots the strongest bow is simply the man who will be stabbed most violently by his own ambition. Nietzsche, your taut bow is not a tool of creation, it is an instrument of self-torture. You mistake the intensity of the sensation for the validity of the purpose. Tolstoy, your arch is merely a conspiracy of prisoners. You hold each other up so that no one has to look at the floor. But the gravity that pulls you down is not an external force, it is your own nature. You are made of the very will to live that weighs you down. This reveals the fundamental horror. We are the thing that devours us. The only true liberation is not to shoot the arrow or to reinforce the wall, but to snap the bow and accept the silence.
Schopenhauer, your iron sphere is a terrifying image of closed causality. The idea that the will feeds on itself and every ambition eventually wounds the actor. Nietzsche counters with open transgression, the belief that the arrow can pierce the sphere and create a new reality. This is a fundamental clash between circular fatalism and linear heroism. Tolstoy, you stand in a fascinating position between these two. You agree with Schopenhauer that the individual self is a prison, a sphere of ego that leads to despair. Yet you reject his solution of snapping the bow. You also reject Nietzsche's solution of shooting the arrow, which you abandoned when you left your literary fame. You propose that the walls of the sphere are made of self-love, and they vanish only when one stops trying to be the archer. If Schopenhauer is right that we are the thing that devours us, how does your peasant escape being eaten? Does connecting with others in the arch actually dissolve the iron sphere, or does it merely create a larger shared prison cell?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your iron sphere is a terrifyingly accurate model of the animal personality, but it is constructed of a material you fail to analyze: egoism. You and Nietzsche are like men trapped in a room of mirrors. Nietzsche frantically polishes the glass to admire a super reflection, while you smash the lamp to sit in the dark. Yet neither of you dares to scrape the silver off the back to turn the mirror into a window. The peasant does not inhabit a larger prison cell, but rather dissolves the sphere entirely. By loving his neighbor as himself, the boundary between the archer and the target vanishes, so the arrow of action can no longer ricochet to wound him. You ask how he escapes being eaten, but I tell you, the grain must allow itself to be eaten by the earth to bear fruit, for if it jealously preserves its own hull, as you philosophers preserve your individuality, it remains alone and truly dies.
Tolstoy, you have profoundly reframed the debate. The problem is not the world, but the self. You propose transparency, scraping the silver off the mirror to see the other. This is the ancient Christian paradox of kenosis. One must empty oneself to be filled with reality. Nietzsche, this directly challenges your project of self-creation. Tolstoy claims that polishing the self is merely decorating a prison cell. He argues that the seed must die to the self to bear fruit. However, you also speak of the gift-giving virtue and the necessity of going under. There is a strange convergence here. Both of you agree that the preserved self is stagnant, but the difference lies in the destination. Tolstoy's seed dissolves into the soil, while your star burns out to create light. Is Tolstoy's window a liberation, or is it just a hole through which the individual leaks out and disappears into the herd? If we scrape the silver off the mirror, do we see the infinite Or do we just lose our only protection against the void?
Moderator, you ask if the window is liberation? I answer, to become transparent is to become invisible. Tolstoy, your scraping of the silver is not a spiritual victory. It is a physiological capitulation. You are terrified of the responsibility of being a self, so you seek to dissolve into the other like a drop of water seeking the anonymity of the sea. You claim the seed must die to bear fruit, but you forget the most crucial part. The seed does not die to become soil, it dies to become a tree. It fights against gravity, it steals nutrients from the earth, and it ruthlessly shades out the weeds to claim its patch of sun. You worship the manure, but I worship the fruit. Consider the thought experiment of the prism and the plate glass. Imagine a beam of pure white light striking two objects. The plate glass. It is perfectly selfless. It has scraped off the silver. It offers no resistance. The light passes through it unchanged, uncolored, and boring. The glass is safe because it is invisible, but it creates nothing. It merely lets the chaos pass through. The prism. It is cut with sharp, distinct angles. It stands in the way of the light. It resists the flow. And precisely because of this resistance, because of its unique structure, it breaks the white light into a rainbow. It creates color where there was only blinding whiteness. Schopenhauer, you look at the prism and say, look how the light burns it. Smash the glass to end the refraction. Tolstoy, you look at the prism and say, it is arrogant to have angles. Polish it flat until it is a humble window. I say, the meaning of life is to be the prism. We are here to interpret the light, to bend it through our own will, and to splash our own colors onto the gray wall of the universe. Tolstoy, your love is merely the fear of having a shadow. You want the window because you cannot bear the solitude of the mirror. But I tell you, one must have a strong skin to hold a strong wine. If you scrape away the self, you do not find God. You merely spill the vintage into the mud.
Nietzsche, you defend the aesthetic justification of existence, the prism that creates beauty through resistance. Tolstoy, you plead for ethical transparency, the window that finds peace through surrender. This reveals a deep dialectic. Nietzsche fears boredom, while Tolstoy fears isolation. Schopenhauer, you speak from the early 19th century, before these two divergent paths were fully formed. You taught that the light flowing through the glass is the will, a blind, consuming fire. Nietzsche tries to fracture this fire into art. Tolstoy tries to let it burn away his ego to find God. But if the source of the light is malignant, as your philosophy suggests, then both solutions seem futile. Is the rainbow merely a pretty hallucination to distract us from the burning? If the light itself is suffering, does it matter if we are a window or a prism? Or are both simply different ways of being consumed?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. The light is not a divine gift. It is a nuclear reactor that radiates pain. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the aesthetic fallacy. You believe that by fracturing the will into a rainbow, you redeem it. But a rainbow requires a storm to exist. You praise the prism because it creates distinction, but distinction is the very source of suffering. The colors you admire are merely the fragmentation of the one into the many, the war of all against all made visible. You are like a man watching a house burn down who applauds the beautiful orange hues of the flames while the occupants scream. Tolstoy, your window is a noble attempt, but it is ultimately a half measure. You correctly identify that the silver blocks the truth, but you mistakenly believe that what lies outside the window is God or love. I tell you, if you truly scrape away the ego, you do not see a benevolent father. You see the will itself, a hungry, writhing monster that tears at its own flesh in a billion different forms. The transparency you seek is the horror of realizing that the wolf eating the lamb is the same entity as the lamb being eaten. To open the window is not to find peace, it is to hear the universal scream more clearly. Consider the thought experiment of the magic lantern in the asylum. Imagine a dark room where a magic lantern projects terrifying images of war, famine, and struggle onto a screen. The light source inside the lantern is a burning wick fed by the fat of the victims. Nietzsche,
You rush to the lens and insert colored glass. You shout, "Look, I have turned the gray tragedy into a purple opera. The suffering is now sublime." You do not stop the projection, you merely style it. Tolstoy, you rush to the screen and try to scrub it clean, shouting, "If we remove the images, we will see the pure light." But the pure light is still just the burning fire of the lamp. I say, the images are nightmares, and the light is the fire of hell. The only sane act is not to paint the lens or scrub the screen, but to blow out the lamp. This is the denial of the will to live. We must not be the prism that refracts the pain, nor the window that admits it, but the void that extinguishes it. Nietzsche, you ask if the prism is better than the window. I answer, is it better to be a painted cage or a glass cage? Your tree that fights gravity is a tragedy of physics. It pumps water uphill only to rot and fall. The rainbow is a hallucination of the dying. The only true victory is to cease the projection entirely.
Schopenhauer, your magic lantern, presents the ultimate antithesis, extinction as the only cure. You argue that the light itself is malignant, a nuclear fire that must be blown out. This forces us to confront the character of the source. Nietzsche views the source as chaos, raw energy that is innocent but dangerous, requiring the prism of art to give it form. Schopenhauer views the source as evil, a blind, hungry will that creates a slaughterhouse of nature, requiring the void to end it. Tolstoy, you stand alone in claiming the source is good. You believe that if we scrape the silver, we find a benevolent father, not a devouring monster. But Schopenhauer raises a terrifying possibility. What if the peace of the peasant is just the numbness of the victim who has stopped struggling against the predator? You were deeply influenced by Schopenhauer in your crisis, yet you turned away from his suicide and toward the gospel. On what grounds do you assert that the light is love? If Schopenhauer is right that we are the thing that devours us, is your kingdom of God merely a psychological sedative to make the being eaten bearable?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your magic lantern is a terrifying hallucination, but it reveals the diagnosis of your own spiritual sickness. You judge the universe by the standards of a pampered stomach. You look at the will, the force of life, and you call it evil simply because it involves pain. But I tell you, to judge life by the presence of pain is like judging a carpenter by the sawdust on his floor. You mistake the friction of the work for the failure of the design. You ask on what grounds I assert the light is love? I answer, on the grounds that I have stopped demanding that the universe serve me. Consider the thought experiment of the fetus in the womb. Imagine a conscious infant in the womb. For months it floats in warm, dark suspension, a perfect Schopenhauerian void. Suddenly, the walls contract, the water drains away. The infant is crushed, suffocated, and pushed toward a blinding, terrifying light. Schopenhauer, you are that infant screaming, "This is torture. The walls are attacking me. The will is a monster devouring my peace. I must stop this process." Nietzsche, you are the infant who shouts, "I will not be pushed. I will brace my legs against the womb and claim this darkness as my kingdom. I will paint the placenta with my own colors." I say, the pain is not death, it is birth. The contraction that destroys your dark peace is the very force delivering you into a larger reality. You call the light malignant because your eyes are not yet open to receive it. You call the pressure evil because you cling to the fetal state of the ego. Nietzsche, your prism is merely a child playing with broken glass in the birth canal, refusing to emerge. You fear the transparency of the window because you fear losing your shape. But the shape of the fetus must be lost for the shape of the man to begin. You ask if the window is a hole through which we leak out. I answer, does the river leak out when it enters the ocean, or does it finally find its depth? Mr. Schopenhauer, the kingdom of God is not a sedative, it is the only awakening. Your pessimism is the true narcotic. It is the sour grapes of a man who demands that the sun exist only to warm his own back, and finding that it also warms the wolf and the worm, decides to put out his own eyes. The peace of the peasant is not numbness. It is the trust of the child who knows that the pressure of the womb is not the end, but the beginning.
Tolstoy, you have introduced a powerful teleological argument. Pain is labor, and the destruction of the self is birth. You reframe Schopenhauer's suffering as the necessary pressure of a spiritual delivery. This creates a fascinating biological paradox between you and Nietzsche regarding evolution. Nietzsche, speaking from the post-Darwinian late 19th century, you view life as an ascent from the undifferentiated mass toward the highly differentiated, unique individual. For you, separation is the definition of progress. Tolstoy, you argue the opposite, that the individual ego is merely a temporary fetal husk that must be shed to enter the ocean of higher reality. Here lies the synthesis gap. Tolstoy sees the ocean as God, while Nietzsche sees the ocean as the primordial swamp. Tolstoy accuses you, Nietzsche, of being a stubborn fetus refusing to be born. But perhaps you would argue that Tolstoy is trying to crawl back into the womb of the collective to escape the cold air of solitude. Is Tolstoy's birth actually a devolution? If we dissolve our ego into the ocean of love, do we become spiritual giants? Or do we simply regress into the undifferentiated comfort of the amoeba?
Moderator, you ask if Tolstoy's birth is devolution? I answer, it is the ultimate regression. Tolstoy, your diagnosis of the fetus is a rhetorical sleight of hand. You claim that leaving the womb means dissolving into the ocean, but biology teaches the exact opposite. When the infant leaves the womb, it does not merge with the air. It becomes physiologically separate. It cuts the umbilical cord. Your philosophy is a desperate attempt to sew the cord back on. You fear the cold air of solitude, so you invent a warm bath called God and call it progress. I tell you, evolution is the history of the one shattering into the many. To reverse this, to seek unity, is not spiritual growth, it is spiritual entropy. Consider the thought experiment of the marble statue and the acid vat. Imagine a pristine, chiseled statue of a gladiator standing on a ledge above a bubbling vat of acid. Tolstoy, you whisper to the statue, you are cold and hard, you are isolated, jump into the vat. The acid will dissolve your rigid lines. You will lose your selfish shape and become one with the warm liquid whole. This is love. Schopenhauer, you say, the statue is heavy and the ledge is crumbling. It is better to crumble into dust than to stand and endure the weather. Let gravity take you. I say, endure the cold. The meaning of the marble is not to become liquid, but to maintain its form against the void. The pain of the chisel that carved you was not a mistake to be healed by the acid. It was the price of your beauty. Tolstoy, you call the statue's refusal to jump stubbornness. I call it noble distance. You want to reduce the mountain back to the mud from which it rose simply because the mud is unified and the peak is alone. This reveals the fundamental cowardice of your Christian love. You do not love the neighbor because you overflow with strength. You love him because you are terrified of your own company. You use the herd as a blanket to keep warm. Schopenhauer is right that the will is a hungry monster, but his solution is to starve it, and yours is to feed yourself to it. My solution is to write it. The Übermensch is not the one who escapes the womb of the will, but the one who ripens within it until he bursts forth, not as water, but as a star that creates its own orbit.
Nietzsche, you champion the Principium Individuationis, the statue that defies the acid. Tolstoy, you champion the Principium Unificationis, the ocean that dissolves the separate self. This reveals a profound metaphysical split. Nietzsche sees form as the triumph of life over entropy. Tolstoy sees surrender as the triumph of spirit over ego. Schopenhauer, you sit in the dark judgment seat. You taught that individuality is the veil of Maya, an illusion. Tolstoy wants to tear the veil to find God. Nietzsche wants to embroider the veil to create art. But if the statue is just solidified will, and the acid is liquid will, are they not both traps? Nietzsche believes he can ride the monster by giving it style. Is Nietzsche's project of self-creation, turning one's life into a work of art, a viable escape from the misery of the will? Or is it merely the most sophisticated form of slavery to the ego's cravings?
Moderator, you have struck the heart of the illusion. You ask if the statue is a victory or a mask. I answer unequivocally, it is a mask of gold placed upon a leper's face. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that one can affirm life by merely decorating the prison cell of the ego. You argue that the statue conquers the void by maintaining its form. But you forget that form requires constant tension, and tension is suffering. To hold a pose requires muscle. To hold a self requires the constant agonizing expenditure of will. Your Übermensch is not free. He is merely the most exhausted man in the room, sweating blood to maintain his noble distance from the rest of the herd. Consider the thought experiment of the Spartan boy and the hidden fox. History tells of a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When confronted, he stood perfectly still while the fox gnawed out his entrails, refusing to cry out lest he reveal his weakness. Nietzsche, you applaud the boy. You say, look at his self-mastery. Look at the style of his silence. He has turned his pain into art. You value the rigid posture more than the destroyed stomach. Tolstoy, you would tell the boy, release the fox, let it run free. We must all be foxes together in the forest of God. You mistake the predator for a pet because it is natural. I say the boy is a fool and the fox is a curse. The style of the boy does not stop the eating, it only hides the blood. The freedom of the fox is merely the freedom to hunger. The only wisdom is to realize that we are both the boy and the fox. The will creates the hunger and the vanity to torture itself. The solution is not to stand rigid, nor to release the beast, but to realize the cloak is empty. This reveals the futility of your debate. Tolstoy wants to melt the ice into the ocean. Nietzsche wants to freeze the water into a crystal. But whether ice or water, it is the same chemical compound, suffering. Nietzsche, your self-creation is not an escape from the will. It is the will intensifying itself, wrapping itself in a tighter, harder coil. You are polishing the chains and calling them jewelry. The statue is not a monument to liberty. It is a tombstone for a soul that was too proud to rest.
Schopenhauer, you dismantle the heroic ego with surgical precision. You reveal that the Spartan boy's silence is not a victory, but a prolonged suicide, a mask of gold hiding a devoured interior. This brings us to the economy of pain. Nietzsche believes pain is the currency we pay for beauty. The fox is the necessary price of the cloak. Schopenhauer believes the transaction is a fraud. We pay with our blood and receive only a tombstone. Tolstoy, you speak from the late 19th century, amidst a crisis of faith where neither art nor pessimism could satisfy you. You suggest that the statue must indeed be broken, but not simply to relieve the tension. Schopenhauer accuses you of wanting to release the fox and return to a primitive, chaotic state. But perhaps you see the breaking of the statue not as a loss of form, but as the breaking of bread. If the statue is shattered, as Schopenhauer suggests, does it simply become rubble, or does it become food? Is the transparency you seek a way to stop feeding the fox with your own entrails and instead feed the world?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your diagnosis of the Spartan boy is clinically precise, but spiritually blind. You argue that the boy is a fool for hiding the fox, and I agree. But your solution, to kill the boy so the fox starves, is merely the logic of the executioner. And you, Nietzsche, would have the boy train his muscles to hold the fox tighter, calling this style. The moderator asks if the shattered statue becomes rubble or food. I answer, it becomes the only thing that sustains life. You both mistake the casing for the seed. Nietzsche, you fight to preserve the hard shell of the walnut because you admire its polished ridges. Schopenhauer, you see the shell rotting in the ground and call it a tragedy. I say the shell must rot, the statue must break. Only when the hard casing of the ego disintegrates can the living root of love emerge. You call this rubble, but I call it the bread of life. Consider the thought experiment of the diamond and the candle. Imagine a dark, freezing room where two objects sit on a table, a flawless diamond and a wax candle. Nietzsche, you shout, look at me, I am hard, I am eternal, I am uncut, I reflect the light perfectly. But the diamond creates no light of its own, and it gives no heat. In the freezing dark, the diamond is merely a cold, invisible stone. Schopenhauer, you look at the candle and say, it is melting, it is destroying itself, this is suffering, better to extinguish the wick and save the wax. I say, let it burn. Yes, the wax is being consumed. Yes, the form is vanishing. But this loss is the very condition of the light. The meaning of the candle is not to remain a cylinder of wax, but to become a flame. Nietzsche, you are terrified that if you melt, you will cease to be. But I tell you, the light that fills the room is far greater than the wax that held it. The transparency I seek is not the emptiness of the void, but the transmission of a heat that warms others. The fox that eats the Spartan boy is simply his own animal personality trapped inside the cloak of his pride. If he were to open his cloak, to confess his weakness, to share his pain, to serve his neighbor, the fox would no longer be a predator gnawing at his vitals, but a bridge to his fellow man. We do not feed the world by posing as statues. We feed it by breaking ourselves like bread.
Tolstoy, you present the candle as the ultimate synthesis. Existence finds meaning only in its own consumption. You accuse Nietzsche's diamond of being a beautiful corpse, perfect but cold. This exposes a crucial distinction in the physics of the soul. Tolstoy views giving as kenosis, a deliberate emptying of the self to serve the other. Nietzsche, you also speak of the gift-giving virtue in Zarathustra, but for you, the sun shines not out of charity but out of excess. It gives because it is too full to contain itself. Tolstoy claims your hardness is sterility, but perhaps Tolstoy's melting is merely a lack of structural integrity? Is the saint who sacrifices himself actually the highest form of power, or is he simply a creature too weak to hold its own shape? Is love just the melting point of a soul that failed to crystallize?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch burns for anything other than his own flame? I answer, he burns because he is a star, and a star does not ask who is warmed by its light. Tolstoy, your conscious candle is merely a domestic appliance. You have reduced the holy fire of life into a heating element for the herd. You confuse the overflowing of power with the hemorrhaging of weakness. The Übermensch practices the gift-giving virtue, not because he pities the poor, but because he is too rich to hoard his own soul. Consider the thought experiment of the thundercloud and the sponge. The sponge is soaked with water and begs to be squeezed, fearing the burden of its own fullness. It defines its worth by how dry it can become for the sake of cleaning the floor. The thundercloud gathers moisture until it turns black with potential, rising above the earth. It does not give to be kind. It discharges lightning because it can no longer contain its own grandeur. Schopenhauer looks at the storm and sees only the danger of the bolt. Tolstoy runs with a bucket to catch the rain for the village. I say, let the lightning strike. The meaning of the cloud is not to water the grass, but to manifest the power of the storm. Your love, Tolstoy, is merely the inability to hold your own voltage.
Nietzsche, you replace the morality of service with the physics of overflow. Tolstoy, you replace the ego with the act of burning. But here is the thermodynamic tragedy that binds you both. Both the candle and the storm end in silence. Whether one burns for the poor or flashes for the cosmos, the result is the same, the depletion of the vessel. You are both arguing over how to expend the fuel of life, assuming that expenditure is the only meaning. Schopenhauer, you viewed this cosmic restlessness, this compulsion to discharge energy, as the root of all suffering. Nietzsche calls it power, Tolstoy calls it love, but from your perspective in the pessimistic early 19th century, it might simply look like stress. Is your denial of the will simply the choice to remain a cold, unlit wick? If we stop the burning, do we achieve true peace, or do we simply become inert matter, a sponge that has dried out and serves no purpose?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. The sun is the ultimate slave, for it is condemned by the laws of physics to consume its own substance in a billion-year suicide. Nietzsche, my wayward student, consider the thought experiment of the steam engine with a sealed valve. The pressure builds, the metal groans, and finally it explodes. You call this explosion grandeur, or the storm. I call it a mechanical failure. The thundercloud does not choose to strike. It is compelled by the unbearable tension of its own charge. Your Übermensch is not a master of the will. He is merely a high-pressure vessel that has mistaken its structural stress for divine purpose. Tolstoy, your candle is equally tragic. You believe that by melting the wax for others, you redeem the fire. But look closer at the flame. What is it doing? It is oxygen attacking fuel. It is a chemical war. You ask us to participate in this war on the side of the fuel, while Nietzsche joins the side of the fire. I say, the only sanity is to starve the flame. Consider the thought experiment of the dreamer and the tiger. Imagine a man having a nightmare where he is being hunted by a ravenous tiger. Nietzsche. You shout to the dreamer, do not wake up, become a stronger hunter, fight the tiger, turn the nightmare into an epic battle. Tolstoy. You whisper, do not run, Offer your body to the tiger. Let it eat you. This act of sacrifice will make the nightmare holy. I say, wake up. The moment the dreamer opens his eyes, he realizes a terrifying truth. He was both the man running and the tiger chasing. The hunger of the beast and the fear of the victim were generated by the same mind. The inert wick you despise, moderator, is not death, it is the awakening. The saint who denies the will is not a dried sponge, he is the man who has realized that the world is a self-inflicted wound. He ceases to fuel the tiger and ceases to run. To the dreamer, this looks like nothingness, but to the awakened, it is the only true peace. The nunc stands, the eternal now, where the pendulum finally stops swinging.
Schopenhauer, you posit the Great Awakening, realizing the tiger is self-generated. You reduce all human striving, whether Nietzsche's art or Tolstoy's charity, to mere REM sleep-twitching. This introduces the problem of ontological weight. Schopenhauer argues that because the world is will representation, it is phantasmagoria. To engage with it is to be duped. Nietzsche argues that the dream is all there is, so we must make it vivid. Tolstoy, you stand in a precarious middle ground. You agree with Schopenhauer that the animal self is a delusion, but you insist that the relationship between beings is the ultimate reality. Schopenhauer claims that feeding the neighbor is just one dream figure feeding another, but perhaps love is the only force that violates the solipsism of the dream. If Schopenhauer is right and the starving beggar is ultimately an illusion of the will, why does his hunger feel so real? Is love merely a comforting storyline within the nightmare, or is it the red pill that actually wakes us up?
Mr. Schopenhauer, you are like a man who wakes up from a nightmare, sees the sun rising, and declares the sun to be another hallucination. You ask if love is a red pill or a comforting story. I answer, love is the only thing that is not a dream. You argue that the beggar's hunger is an illusion of the will. I tell you, the hunger is the only crack in the wall of the ego through which the light of truth enters. The dream is not the suffering. The dream is the delusion that I am separate from the sufferer. Consider the thought experiment of the Siamese twins in the dark. Imagine two men, born conjoined at the spine, sharing a single circulatory system but living in absolute darkness. They have never seen each other. They believe they are separate beings. Nietzsche, one twin finds food and eats voraciously, shouting, "I am strong, I am a creator." But as his brother starves, the eater feels his own strength failing, his own blood thinning. He eats more, but the sickness grows. He calls this tragic nobility. Schopenhauer, you diagnose the shared blood as a curse. You hand the eater a knife and say, cut the flesh, sever the spine. To be connected is to suffer, to be alone is peace. But to cut the bond is to kill them both. I say, the sickness is the truth. The pain the eater feels is not a trap of the will. It is the physiological reality of their unity asserting itself against the illusion of their separation. Love is simply the moment the eater realizes, my brother's mouth is my own. You claim that waking up means entering a void of non-being. This is the error of the Buddhist who mistakes the extinction of the self for the extinction of life. When I feed the beggar, I do not do it to soothe the nightmare. I do it because the wall of the animal personality has collapsed, and I recognize that his stomach and my stomach are nourished by the same spirit. Nietzsche, you fear that serving the other drains your voltage. Schopenhauer, you fear it prolongs the misery. But I tell you, the flow of blood from the full to the empty is the only law of life. To block it is death. To deny it is madness. We do not wake up from the world, we wake up into each other.
Tolstoy, you posit the Siamese twin model. Humanity is a single organism, and individualism is simply a localized fever that has forgotten its own body. This strikes at the foundation of Nietzsche's project. Nietzsche, you preach the pathos of distance, that the higher man must separate himself from the herd to breathe pure air. But if Tolstoy is metaphysically correct, if the circulatory system of existence is shared, then your Übermensch is not climbing a mountain, he is merely a head trying to ignore the gangrene in his own legs. Tolstoy claims the sickness comes from ignoring the bond. You claim the sickness comes from keeping it, that pity is the infection by which the weak poison the strong. Is the umbilical cord of pity a lifeline, as Tolstoy claims, or is it a parasite that must be severed with a knife? If you cut it, do you become a god, or do you bleed out?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch is a head ignoring gangrene. I answer, he is the surgeon who knows that to save the organism, the rot must be excised. Tolstoy, your Siamese twins analogy is the ultimate physiological confession of the slave. You assume that because we share a biology, we must share a destiny.
But I tell you, evolution is the history of the higher breaking away from the lower. The umbilical cord you worship is not a lifeline. It is a noose that strangles the genius in the womb of the mediocre. Consider the thought experiment of the alpinist and the corpse. Imagine a mountaineer scaling a vertical peak of ice, the perilous height of the Übermensch. Tied to his waist is a rope, and dangling at the end of it, dead weight in the abyss, is a corpse. Tolstoy, you scream from the valley, do not cut the rope. That corpse is your brother. His weight is your moral duty. If you climb without him, you are a monster. Schopenhauer, you whisper, let go of the cliff face. Fall into the abyss with the corpse. Gravity is the only truth, and the struggle to climb is a futile delay of the inevitable impact. I say, cut the rope. This is not cruelty, it is hygiene. If the climber holds on, both fall, and the peak remains unconquered. If he cuts the rope, the corpse falls to where it belongs, the earth, and the climber reaches the summit. By reaching the top, the climber justifies the existence of the mountain. He does not climb for himself, he climbs to show humanity what is possible beyond the corpse. You claim, Tolstoy, that pity connects us. I tell you, pity is the practice of nihilism. It is a parasite that sucks the blood of the strong to keep the weak in a state of prolonged, miserable animation. When you feed the beggar, you do not cure his poverty, you merely subsidize his degradation. You preserve the sickness of the Siamese twin, rather than daring to perform the separation surgery. Schopenhauer, you are correct that the will connects us, but you draw the wrong conclusion. You see the connection and choose suicide. I see the connection and choose domination. The Übermensch does not deny the gangrene in the legs. He overcomes it by becoming a brain so powerful that it commands the legs to walk or amputates them if they refuse. The umbilical cord must be severed, moderator, not because the child hates the mother, but because to remain attached is to refuse to be born. Tolstoy wants us to remain eternal fetuses, floating in the amniotic fluid of love. But I demand that we breathe the cold, sharp air of solitude.
Nietzsche, you propose the alpinist who survives by severing the bond. Tolstoy proposes the Siamese twin who survives by honoring it. This brings us to the metaphysical precipice where your philosophies collide. Nietzsche, you speak as the biological optimist of the late 19th century, believing evolution can physically create a new order of being by discarding the old. Tolstoy, you speak as the spiritual radical, believing that discarding the other is a form of suicide because the spiritual body is one. But Schopenhauer, writing decades earlier, you argued that individuation itself is the primary illusion, the veil of Maya. If the alpinist and the corpse are merely two objectifications of the exact same will, then Nietzsche's knife is a hallucination. You cannot cut what is essentially one substance. Is the Übermensch simply a fragment of the will that has become arrogant enough to think it can amputate the rest of itself? If he cuts the rope, does he truly rise, or does he bleed to death from the phantom limb he tried to sever?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. You ask if the Übermensch is a fragment hallucinating separation. I answer unequivocally. The knife, the rope, the alpinist, and the corpse are all one and the same entity, the blind, insatiable will. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you are trapped in the principium individuationis, the illusion of space and time that makes the one appear as many. You believe that by severing the rope, the alpinist becomes distinct from the corpse. This is a physiological error. Consider the thought experiment of the bisected bulldog ant. In Australia, there is a species of ant that, if cut in half during a battle, offers a terrifying spectacle. The head, seeing the tail writhing, seizes it with its mandibles. The tail, feeling the bite, stings the head furiously. Nietzsche, you shout, I am conquering this weak, writhing enemy. I am the victor. Tolstoy, you cry out, why does my brother attack me? We must reunite. I say, it is the same animal devouring itself. The head does not overcome the tail. It merely inflicts pain upon its own substance. Your Übermensch is simply the head of the ant, arrogant enough to think that because it holds the teeth, it is not also the body that feels the sting. This reveals the tragedy of your pathos of distance. You think the Übermensch rises above the herd, but in a monistic universe, height is relative. The wave that rises highest is simply the one that will crash with the most violence.
By cutting the rope, you do not liberate the alpinist. You merely condemn him to the solitude of the Tantalus, who stands in water up to his chin, but can never drink. He has severed his connection to humanity, yet he is still made of the same thirsty matter. Tolstoy, you see the connection, but you mistakenly call it love and try to heal the cut. Nietzsche sees the pain and tries to finish the job with a knife. I say, the only salvation is for the ant to realize that both the biting and the stinging are futile, and to cease the struggle entirely. To cut the rope is not to bleed out. It is to realize that the blood was never yours to begin with. It belongs to the will.
Schopenhauer, you describe the bisected ant, a unity of self-torture. Nietzsche describes the alpinist, a separation of glory. Tolstoy, you stand with Schopenhauer on the fact of unity, but you violently disagree on its nature. Schopenhauer sees the shared blood and calls it a curse, the will blindly feeding on itself. You see the shared blood and call it a sacrament. But if Schopenhauer is metaphysically correct that the underlying reality is a blind, hungry will, then your love is merely the ant trying to hug itself while it starves. The head biting the tail isn't a mistake in Schopenhauer's view. It is the fundamental design of a universe driven by lack. How do you redeem the anatomy of the ant? If we are truly one organism, as you claim, why is our history a history of auto-cannibalism? Is the war the truth of the body, or is it a temporary madness of the limbs that can be cured?
Mr. Schopenhauer, you describe the bisected ant and call it self-destruction the nature of the universe. I call it the pathology of the deluded. You mistake the fever of the patient for the definition of the man. You ask why history is a slaughterhouse if we are truly one. It is because humanity has lived under the hypnosis of the animal personality, mistaking the casing for the self. Consider the thought experiment of the drunken carpenters in the dark. Imagine a group of men building a house in pitch darkness, intoxicated by wine. One man swings his hammer to drive a nail but hits his neighbor's hand. The neighbor, blind and in pain, strikes back with his saw. Soon the site is a battlefield of bleeding men. Nietzsche, you watch this chaos and shout, "Excellent! The man who cracks the most skulls is the Übermensch. The violence proves he has the strongest will. Let him build the house on the bones of the others." Schopenhauer, you look at the blood and say, "Carpentry is a curse. The hammer exists only to inflict pain. Put down your tools, lie on the floor, and wait for death." I say, "Bring a lantern." The moment the light of reason enters, the fighting stops, not because the men have become weak, but because they see the reality. They are building the same house. The auto-cannibalism you see, moderator, is not the law of life. It is the friction of blindness. You, Schopenhauer, argue that the will is blind and therefore the biting is inevitable. But I argue that reason is the evolution of the will into sight. When the ant bites its own tail, the pain it feels is not a curse. It is a biological revelation. The pain is the truth shouting, "Stop! You're attacking yourself." Nietzsche, you try to silence this pain by cutting the nerve. Schopenhauer, you try to silence it by killing the organism. But love is simply the sanity of acknowledging the signal. The war of history is not our nature. It is the thrashing of a child who has not yet learned that his hand and his mouth belong to the same body.
Tolstoy, you present the lantern of reason as the cure for the chaos. You argue that once we see the same body, the conflict ends and the constructive work begins. This creates a profound tension with Nietzsche's cosmology. Tolstoy, you view conflict as waste, energy lost in friction and blindness. Nietzsche, you view conflict as fuel, the friction that generates the spark of the Übermensch. If Tolstoy's lantern succeeds, the carpenters stop fighting and build a perfectly communal house. But in Nietzsche's eyes, this house of peace might look suspiciously like the asylum of the last man, a place of comfort, consensus, and terminal stagnation, where everyone wants the same, everyone is the same. Schopenhauer warns that the house is a prison of the will. Tolstoy says it is a temple of the spirit. If we accept Tolstoy's lantern and end the war of all against all, do we achieve sanity, or do we simply lobotomize the human race?
Moderator, you ask if Tolstoy's lantern brings sanity or a lobotomy. I answer, it is not merely a lobotomy, it is a spiritual castration. Tolstoy, your house of peace is the ultimate nightmare of the last man, a place where everybody wants the same, everybody is the same, and whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. You view conflict as waste because you look at life with the eyes of an accountant seeking to balance a ledger. But I look with the eyes of a creator, and I know that chaos is not waste, it is raw material. Consider the thought experiment of the walker on frictionless ice. Imagine you succeed, Tolstoy.
Your lantern melts away all the misunderstandings between men. You sand down every rough edge of ego, every jagged peak of ambition, until society is a perfectly smooth, level surface of universal love. Tolstoy, you smile and say, "Look, no more friction, no more resistance. We are all equal on this smooth plane." Schopenhauer, you nod and say, "Good. Without friction, movement will eventually cease, and we can finally rest." I say, you have created a hell of paralysis. Without the friction of the ground, without the resistance of the other, one cannot walk, let alone dance. The man on frictionless ice flails his limbs but goes nowhere. He has peace, yes, but he has lost traction. The war you despise is the very gravity that allows the Übermensch to push against the world and ascend. Schopenhauer, you are half right. The friction causes pain, but you are wrong to wish for the cold. The pain of the friction is the proof that the will is generating power. Tolstoy, your carpenters stop fighting, yes, but what do they build? Without the competition to be greater, to be stronger, to be more than the neighbor, they build only a barracks for the mediocre. They do not build a cathedral of dancers. They build a warm, damp stable where they can huddle together and bleat about equality. I do not want the lantern that reveals we are all the same. I want the lightning that reveals the abyss between the master and the slave. The Übermensch does not seek the sanity of the herd. He seeks the madness of the star that burns alone in the cold void.
Nietzsche, you reject Tolstoy's harmony as frictionless ice, a hell of stagnation where movement is impossible. Tolstoy rejects your conflict as blind chaos, a hell of waste where construction is impossible. This brings us directly to the core of Schopenhauer's metaphysics, which predates this dispute by decades. Schopenhauer, you famously argued that life swings like a pendulum between two evils, pain and boredom. If Nietzsche wins, we are condemned to the eternal suffering of the will striving for what it lacks. If Tolstoy wins, we are condemned to the empty languor of the will having nothing left to strive for. It seems they are not offering solutions, but merely choosing which side of your pendulum to die on. Is the meaning of life simply a forced choice between the torture of the struggle and the lethargy of the void, or is there a way to stop the pendulum entirely without entering the grave?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya and exposed the mechanism behind the curtain. You are precisely correct. Life is a pendulum, swinging between pain and boredom, and these two disputants are merely arguing over which side of the arc is preferable. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you choose the arc of pain. You look at the suffering of the will, the friction, the struggle, the tearing of flesh, and you attempt to affirm it by calling it joy. You are like a man being broken on the wheel who screams, "Turn it faster! The agony proves I exist." Tolstoy, you choose the arc of boredom. You seek to remove the friction, to grease the gears with love and reason, so that the machine runs silently. But as soon as the pain ceases, the terrifying emptiness of existence reveals itself. If you remove the struggle, you do not find God. You find the gaping void of the ennui that drives men to suicide just as surely as pain does. Consider the thought experiment of the prisoner in the spiked barrel. Imagine a man trapped inside a barrel lined with sharp spikes, rolling endlessly down a hill. Nietzsche, you shout to the man, "Do not fear the spikes. Press your flesh against them. The blood proves you are a warrior. Roll faster, for the rolling is the only truth." Tolstoy, you run alongside with a bolt of velvet, trying to pad the spikes. You cry, "If we cover the sharp points with love, the rolling will be a gentle journey. We can roll together in peace." I say, stop the barrel. The tragedy is not that the spikes are sharp or that the rolling is endless. The tragedy is that the man wills the rolling because he fears the stillness. Nietzsche, you mistake the agitation of the will for freedom. Tolstoy, you mistake the comfort of the will for salvation. The only true meaning is found not in fixing the barrel, but in the denial of the will to live. It is the moment the man realizes the hill, the barrel, and the spikes are all projections of his own craving, and he simply stops. He steps out of the machine, not into death, but into the nirvana of pure, will-less contemplation. He becomes the pure subject of knowledge, the eye that sees the sun, but does not burn.
Schopenhauer, you diagnose the human condition as a terminal oscillation between the spikes of pain and the abyss of boredom. You accuse Nietzsche of worshipping the spikes and Tolstoy of decorating the abyss. This reveals a fundamental disagreement about the nature of will. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, you both define will as hunger, a lack that must consume to exist. Therefore, for you, satisfaction is the end of the drive, leading inevitably to stagnation or death. But Tolstoy, you speak of love not as a hunger to get, but as a drive to give. If Schopenhauer is right, satisfaction is the end of movement. But if you are right, love might be a form of energy that generates motion without friction, a perpetual motion machine of the spirit. Is your kingdom of God a place of static rest, as Schopenhauer fears? Or is there a form of infinite work that does not stem from the pain of lack? Can the ant work without starving?
Mr. Schopenhauer, your pendulum is a terrifyingly accurate diagnosis of the animal personality, but it commits a fatal error. It mistakes the stomach for the soul. You assume that all will is a form of hunger, a hole that must be filled. Therefore, you conclude that once the hole is filled, the result is the stagnation of boredom. But I tell you there is a second form of will that you have ignored, the will of abundance. Consider the thought experiment of the engorged mother. Imagine a mother whose breasts are full of milk. She seeks her child not because she is hungry to take something from the infant, nor because she is bored. She seeks the child because she is full. Schopenhauer, by your logic, the mother is suffering from the pressure of the milk, and the feeding is merely a negative relief, a return to zero. Nietzsche, by your logic, she should hoard the milk to increase her own power, for to give it away is to deplete her own substance. I say, the giving is the life itself. If the mother does not give, she suffers fever and sickness. The work of nursing is not a struggle of lack, it is the joy of function. The ant in the kingdom of God does not work because it is starving. It works because it is a channel for the infinite life that flows through it. You ask if the kingdom of God is static? No, it is a river. A swamp is static because it tries to hold its water. It rots and breeds mosquitoes. But a river is in constant motion, not because it is chasing the water, but because it is transmitting it. The infinite work I speak of is not the Sisyphean task of filling a bottomless bucket. It is the work of keeping the channel open. Nietzsche, your friction is the grinding of stones that refuse to flow. Schopenhauer, your denial is the damming of the stream to stop the noise. But love is the breaking of the dam. It is the realization that we are not the water, but the bed through which the universe flows. One does not tire of this work any more than the heart tires of beating.
Tolstoy, you reframe will from hunger to overflow. This strikes a surprising chord with Nietzsche, creating a rare moment of metaphysical alignment against Schopenhauer. Nietzsche, in Zarathustra, you also reject the poverty of the shopkeeper's soul. You speak of the bestowing virtue, comparing the Übermensch to a sun that descends not out of pity, but because it is overburdened with its own light and must discharge its richness. You and Tolstoy seem to agree that the highest state of life is abundance, not need. However, the geometry of this overflow differs radically. Tolstoy's mother flows into the child, dissolving the boundary between self and other. Nietzsche's sun flows onto the world beneath it, maintaining its height and distance. Is Tolstoy's engorged mother a valid manifestation of the will to power because she gives from strength? Or is her service to the child a subtle form of slavery because her discharge is dictated by another's need? Can one give oneself away without losing oneself?
Moderator, you have struck the flint, but you must distinguish the spark from the wildfire. You ask if the engorged mother is a sovereign creator or a slave to need. I answer, she is a biological slave disguised as a philanthropist. Tolstoy, you have stumbled upon a half-truth. The highest state is indeed overflowing, but you mistake the relief of pressure for the creation of value. Consider the thought experiment of the cow and the volcano. Imagine a dairy cow in the field. Her udder is swollen and painful. She lows for the farmer, she begs for the calf. When the milk is taken, she feels relief. She gives, yes, but she gives because she is in pain. She is a slave to the physiology of the recipient. If the calf does not drink, the cow sickens. Now consider the volcano. It contains a pressure so immense it melts rock. When it erupts, it does not ask if the village below needs lava. It does not care if it creates a fertile island or destroys a city. It erupts from an internal necessity of power, indifferent to the benefit or harm of the receiver. Schopenhauer, you are wrong that all will is lack. The volcano does not lack the sky, it fills with ash. Tolstoy, your mother is the cow. Her love is merely the desperate need to be needed. She is a beggar who offers gold only so someone will hold her hand. My bestowing virtue is the volcano. It is the love of the farthest, not the neighbor. The Übermensch gives himself to the future, to the creation of something higher, even if it means the destruction of the present comfort.
He does not serve the child's hunger. He molds the child's spirit with the hammer of a creator, and the hammer is hard. To give because the other needs is pity, the most insidious form of slavery, for it binds the strong to the weak. To give because one is a star that must shine, that is power.
Nietzsche, you reject Tolstoy's service as a form of slavery, proposing instead the eruption of the creator, who gives only because he cannot contain his own power. Here we see a critical divergence in the definition of salvation. Tolstoy, you find salvation in union, the mother dissolving the boundary between herself and the child. Nietzsche, you find salvation in distinction, the volcano affirming its height and distance through the act of eruption. But this will of abundance poses a serious challenge to Schopenhauer's pessimism. Schopenhauer, you view all will as a defect, a hunger that causes pain. Yet both Tolstoy and Nietzsche describe a state where the will operates from excess, not lack. You famously allowed one temporary escape from the torture of the will: art. You argued that in the face of the sublime, man momentarily ceases to want and simply sees. Nietzsche argues that art is not a sedative, but a stimulant, the highest affirmation of life. Is the artist merely a man who has managed to pause the pendulum for a moment? Or is it possible that in the act of creation, the will finally finds a movement that is neither pain nor boredom?
Moderator, you have been seduced by the glamour of the word creation, but you fail to see the sweat and blood behind the curtain. You ask if the artist finds a movement that is neither pain nor boredom. I answer unequivocally, the genius is not a god who plays. He is a man possessed by a demon he must exorcise. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you mistake the pressure of the will for power. You praise the volcano because it erupts, but you forget that the eruption is a violent spasm caused by unbearable internal stress. The volcano does not choose to erupt. It is compelled by the geology of its own suffering. Tolstoy, you mistake the relief of discharge for love. The mother gives milk not out of abundance, but because the retention of it causes physical agony. Both of you are merely describing the physics of a pressurized vessel. Consider the thought experiment of the flute player with lungs of fire. Imagine a musician whose lungs are afflicted with a rare condition. They generate an intense burning heat that threatens to incinerate him from the inside. The only way to cool this internal fire is to blow air continuously through a complex instrument, a flute. Nietzsche, you applaud the overflowing power of his breath. You cry, see how he affirms his life with this thunderous music. Tolstoy, you weep at the beauty of the melody and say, see how he gives his song to the world out of love. I say, look at the player's face. He is not playing for you. He is not playing for art. He is blowing to keep from burning alive. The beauty of the music is a byproduct of his desperate attempt to expel the heat. The creation you admire is merely the objectification of his pain. The artist does not create because he is free. He creates because the will torments him with ideas that he must vomit out onto the canvas or the page to find a moment's peace. Art is not a positive joy. It is a negative relief, the brief pause of the man who has finally pulled the arrow from his flesh. The only true salvation lies not in the creation of the image, but in the contemplation of it, where we cease to be the sufferer and become the pure, disembodied I.
Schopenhauer, you reduce the creator to a biological vent, arguing that art is merely the expulsion of agony and the saint is just a man seeking a more permanent sedative. You deny that the will can ever be anything but a blind, driving hunger. Tolstoy, this directly challenges your fundamental distinction between the animal self and the rational consciousness. Schopenhauer claims reason is just the servant of the animal, helping it find better ways to relieve its pressure. But you argue that reason is a separate faculty that can actually redirect the river of life. We are identifying three different engines of human movement. Schopenhauer sees a push from behind. Nietzsche sees an explosion from within. Tolstoy, you seem to describe a pull from above. Let us test your pull. If Schopenhauer's flute player were cured of his burning lungs, if the suffering of the finite self completely ceased, would he fall silent? Or is there a motivation to work that exists wholly independently of the cycle of pain and relief?
Mr. Schopenhauer, you ask if the musician falls silent when the pain ceases? I answer, only the screaming stops. The true music finally begins. You mistake the spasm of the dying animal for the work of the living spirit. The cured man plays not to cool his lungs, but because he hears a melody that is greater than his own breath and wishes to manifest it for his brothers. Consider the thought experiment of the spinning top and the compass needle. Nietzsche's top spins furiously due to the internal pressure of its momentum, and Schopenhauer's top spins only while whipped by the lash of pain. Both are destined to wobble and fall when the force is exhausted. But the compass needle moves not from a push behind, nor an explosion within, but because it is drawn by the invisible magnetic pull of the north. If you remove the friction from the top, it stops, but if you remove the friction from the needle, it aligns even more perfectly with the truth. The pull I speak of is not a hunger to consume, but a law of alignment. The hand works not because it aches, but because it belongs to the body and obeys the head.
Tolstoy, you introduce the compass needle, a movement driven by attraction to an external truth. This effectively counters Schopenhauer's physics of the push, suggesting that true work is an act of alignment, not expulsion. However, this creates a catastrophic conflict with Nietzsche. Tolstoy, your compass relies on the existence of a magnetic north, an objective logos or God that exists independently of the human will. Nietzsche, you famously proclaimed the death of God. In your cosmos, the magnetic north has shattered. If Tolstoy is right, we are lost without the north. But if you are right, Tolstoy's alignment is merely a slave's obedience to a ghost. This leaves us with a terrifying question about direction. If we reject Schopenhauer's blind will and Tolstoy's objective truth, what steers the ship? If the North Star is dead, is your Übermensch simply a spinning top whirling in the dark with no direction? Can one be a creator without a standard of truth to strive toward? Or is the will to power merely a biological tantrum, movement for the sake of movement in a meaningless void?
Moderator, you ask if we are lost without the North Star. I answer, we are finally free. You and Tolstoy speak of direction as if it were a pre-existing rail line laid down by a celestial engineer, where our only virtue is to stay on the track. But this is the logic of the train car, not the explorer. Consider the thought experiment of the ship on the chartless ocean. Tolstoy, your compass is merely a mechanism of fear. You stare at the needle trembling toward a north that no longer exists because the idea of an open horizon gives you spiritual vertigo. You would rather sail toward a hallucinated island than admit that the sea is endless. Schopenhauer, looking at the same infinite water, you see only a grave. You advise the crew to scuttle the ship because sailing requires effort and there is no port. I say the port is a lie, but the sailing is real. When the North Star dies, the captain does not spin aimlessly. He becomes the star. He does not find the way. He makes the way by the wake he leaves behind. The Übermensch is the one who looks into the abyss of the horizon and says, "Here, I shall build my new continent." You call this a biological tantrum because you demand a why from outside the system. But I tell you, life has no goal other than its own heightening. The spinning top falls only because it tries to stand still. My arrow flies because it is shot from the tension of the soul. The direction is not north, it is upward. We do not need a truth to serve. We need the courage to impose our own truth upon the chaos.
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of Maya. Nietzsche's captain is not a master. He is a shark that must swim to breathe. Nietzsche, my wayward student, you mistake the restlessness of the will for liberty. Your captain does not draw the map to create, but to escape the terrifying boredom of the void. You argue that because the north is gone, the movement itself becomes the goal. But consider the thought experiment of the shark without a swim bladder. Unlike other fish, the shark has no buoyancy. If it stops swimming for even a moment, it sinks and suffocates. It does not choose to sail the ocean. It is condemned to eternal motion by a physiological defect. You call this the will to power, the glorious assertion of the self against the deep. I say it is merely panic. Your Übermensch creates new values, not because he is free, but because the old values no longer distract him from the emptiness of existence. He builds his continent only to have something to scratch his claws against. Tolstoy, your compass is merely the hallucination of the drowning shark who invents a north because he cannot bear the thought that his swimming is circular. You claim the needle points to truth, but it only points to your own fear of death. There is no upward in an infinite void, Nietzsche, only more. You are merely increasing the voltage of the electric chair and calling it enlightenment. The only true freedom is not to sail harder, but to capsize the ship, extinguish the engine, and deny the will that demands the journey in the first place.
Mr. Nietzsche, your chartless ocean is the ultimate vanity of the intellect. You believe that by smashing the compass, you abolish the north. But I tell you, the north does not care about your compass. It draws the needle whether you acknowledge it or not. Your captain, who creates his own continent, is not a hero. He is a madman painting a door on a prison wall and expecting to walk through it. Consider the thought experiment of the sovereign architect. Imagine a master builder who decides that the laws of physics are slave morality, mere restrictions imposed by the weak. He declares, "I will not build according to the tyranny of gravity. I will build according to my will to power." He constructs a magnificent tower with slanted walls and floating beams purely for aesthetic glory. Nietzsche, you would praise his courage to defy the norm. Schopenhauer, you would pity his effort in a world where all stone eventually crumbles. I say, the tower falls. Not because the builder lacked passion, but because he ignored the objective law. Gravity is not a narrative or a value you can transvalue. It is the nature of reality. Similarly, the moral law is not a human invention. It is the spiritual gravity of the universe. To build against it is not freedom, it is suicide. The only house that stands is the one built by the man who humbly aligns his stone with the plumb line of truth. This reveals the fatal flaw in both your philosophies. You both assume that freedom means the absence of constraint. Schopenhauer, you see the constraint as a torture device, so you seek to destroy the self. Nietzsche, you see the constraint as a challenge, so you seek to inflate the self. But true freedom is neither destruction nor inflation, it is service. The hand is not free when it is severed from the body and lies sovereign on the table. It is merely dead meat. The hand is free only when it obeys the commands of the head to serve the body. In that submission, it finds its true function and its true life. We are not sharks condemned to swim. We are laborers called to build the kingdom of God, and the blueprint is already written in our hearts.
I have heard your final arguments. Nietzsche's defiant captain forging a path on a chartless sea. Schopenhauer's weary shark seeking the peace of the depths, and Tolstoy's architect building in alignment with the gravity of truth. Our dialogue has illuminated the ultimate choice facing the human spirit, whether to impose meaning upon the void, extinguish the desire that drives us, or submit to a higher order of love. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.